Lake Texcoco life. What if the whole city you lived in floated? That's basically what life was like in Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital. Forget your neighborhood streets. Forget taking a walk to the store. You'd be grabbing a canoe just to visit your neighbor. Tenochtitlan wasn't built on solid ground at all. It was smack in the middle of Lake Texcoco, a huge body of water surrounded by mountains. The city itself sat on a series of artificial islands, connected by long stone causeways. Imagine Venice, but way bigger, way busier, and way scarier if you can't swim. The lake wasn't exactly a crystal-clear vacation spot either. It was shallow, brackish, and salty in places, which meant it stank during the dry season. Everywhere you looked, there were canals crisscrossing the city like watery streets. People used wooden canoes called aquilies to get around. Kids learned to paddle before they could run. And you'd be the awkward outsider, tipping your boat every time you tried to turn around. Fall in, and you'd find out real fast that Lake Texcoco wasn't exactly clean. There were fish, sure, but also trash, dead animals, and sometimes even human remains floating around. Life there also meant you couldn't just wander into the wilderness if things went bad. There was no running away into the forest. You were surrounded by water, and those causeways were guarded. The city was designed to trap invaders and control movement, which is cool until you realize you're the one stuck inside with no way out. Daily life depended completely on the lake. Drinking water came from aqueducts that brought fresh water in from the surrounding hills. Cut off that supply, and the whole city could run dry in days. And since the city sat lower than the surrounding land, flooding was a constant threat. Heavy rains could turn the streets into waist-deep waterways overnight. People just dealt with it. They bailed water out of their homes, rebuilt, and kept going. Oh, and the smell. You'd have to get used to it fast. Between the shallow lake, the constant fishing, and the thousands of people tossing waste into the water, Tenochtitlan probably reeked like a fish market mixed with a public bathroom. The Aztecs were surprisingly clean. They bathed daily, but the lake itself had its own permanent stink. So surviving here wasn't just about food and shelter. It was about mastering a completely different way of moving, living, and thinking. If you weren't good on the water, you'd be lost, literally. And that's the real challenge. If you got dropped into Tenochtitlan today, your first enemy wouldn't be a warrior, a priest, or a disease. It would be the lake itself. Could you learn to paddle fast enough to keep up with a city of experts? Or would you be the clumsy newcomer everyone laughed at as you fell in for the third time that day?
Floating gardens. Think farming is boring? Not in the Aztec Empire. Their farms didn't even touch solid ground. They built them right on the water, turning the swampy edges of Lake Texcoco into an agricultural machine. These were the famous chinampas, sometimes called floating gardens, and if you landed in the Aztec capital, they'd blow your mind. But here's the thing, they weren't really floating. The Aztecs piled mud, reeds, and lake-bed sediment into long rectangular plots anchored to the bottom of the shallow lake. Picture endless green rafts, neatly lined up like rows in a parking lot, each one bursting with maize, beans, squash, chilies, and flowers. And they were efficient. One chinampa could grow several crops a year, feeding the massive population of Tenochtitlan. Sounds beautiful, right? A green paradise on the water. Sure, until you realize you're trapped. Because with chinampas stretching across the wetlands, there was nowhere to just run off into the open field if you got into trouble. The whole system was like a giant maze, full of canals barely wide enough for canoes. If you needed to escape danger, good luck paddling your way out. There were guards, patrols, and watchful eyes everywhere. And working on them wasn't exactly peaceful gardening either. This was back-breaking labor. Farmers started before dawn, hauling muck from the lake bottom to keep the soil fertile. Mosquitoes swarmed constantly. Sunburn roasted your skin during the dry season, and in the wet season, everything was slick and muddy. The Aztecs loved order, so chinampas had to be kept in perfect rows. Let weeds take over your plot, and someone would notice. And yes, there were punishments for lazy farmers. Then there was the eerie silence at night. Imagine sitting on a chinampa at dusk, the water flat as glass, frogs croaking, and somewhere far away the drums from Tenochtitlan's temples starting up. That meant sacrifices were happening. The same canals you worked in during the day could carry canoes full of priests, warriors, or even prisoners on their way to the great temple. And don't think about hiding on a chinampa if things went bad. They were community-controlled, meaning everyone knew who worked which plot. A stranger crouched in the corn would stick out like a sore thumb, and there would be nowhere to go once someone spotted you. So yes, chinampas were brilliant engineering. They fed hundreds of thousands of people, kept the city thriving, and looked incredible. But they were also a reminder that this was a place you couldn't just walk away from. Everything was connected, literally. You couldn't escape the system. Even the farm you worked on was surrounded by water and watchful neighbors. Drop yourself in the middle of that network today, and you wouldn't last long. You'd either be hopelessly lost in the green maze or get put to work hauling mud before sunrise. Either way, the chinampas wouldn't let you off easy.
Altitude. Ever walked up a flight of stairs and felt totally out of breath? Now picture feeling like that all the time, just from standing around. That's what would hit you the second you arrived in the Valley of Mexico. Because Tenochtitlan wasn't sitting on some cozy valley floor. Nope.
It was more than 7,000 feet above sea level, higher than Denver, higher than most mountains you've probably hiked. The air up there is thin, meaning every breath gives you less oxygen than your body is used to. If you weren't born there, your lungs and blood would be playing catch-up for days, maybe weeks. People who came in from the coast often got dizzy, nauseous, or passed out entirely. And that's just from standing around, not from hauling water, grinding corn, or paddling a canoe all day like a local. The Aztecs, of course, were used to it. They had bigger lung capacity, their blood carried oxygen more efficiently, and they could run across causeways like it was nothing. You'd be red-faced and gasping halfway to the market. You might even develop altitude sickness, pounding headaches, sleepless nights, and nausea so bad you'd lose your appetite. Not ideal in a place where food is mostly corn mush and chilies. And it wasn't just the air pressure that made life tough. The sun was more intense at that height too, so you'd burn faster. The nights got surprisingly cold, bone-chillingly cold, even if the days felt hot. You'd be sitting around a smoky fire, wrapped in a cloak, wondering how anyone ever thought this was a good place to build a city. But there's a reason the Aztecs loved this spot. The altitude made their capital easy to defend. Invading armies from the lowlands were often exhausted before they even reached the city. You can't fight well when you're doubled over trying to breathe. In fact, the Aztecs knew this and used it to their advantage. They'd force enemies to march quickly, knowing they'd arrive completely worn out and ready to collapse. And let's not forget, even basic chores would feel like Olympic events until you adopted. Want to carry a bucket of water? Your heart would be pounding. Grind maize on a stone for an hour? You'd be dripping sweat. Walk up the steps of the Templo Mayor, which has over 100 steep steps, while everyone's watching you? Forget about it. You'd be the one lying flat halfway up, becoming the punchline of the day. So if you think you could just drop into Aztec life and keep up, think again. Before you even worried about warriors, sacrifices, or tribute collectors, you'd be trying to figure out how to breathe without looking like you were dying. In the Valley of Mexico, the first thing that would try to kill you was the sky itself.
Thin air, thick smog. Think breathing is easy? Not in Tenochtitlan. You're already struggling because of the altitude, right? Well, now imagine that the little oxygen you can get smells like a campfire that never goes out. The Valley of Mexico wasn't just high. It was basically a giant bowl that trapped every bit of smoke, ash, and dust that got in. Every home in Tenochtitlan had a cooking fire, and we're talking about a city with hundreds of thousands of people. Breakfast meant smoke, dinner meant smoke. Every festival, every ritual, every torch in the temples added to the haze. The air was rarely clear. It was always a little bit thick, a little bit acrid. Locals were used to it. Your throat would feel scratchy before lunchtime, and by the end of the day, you'd sound like you'd smoked a pack of cigarettes. And if that wasn't enough, the valley had another surprise for you: volcanic ash. The two volcanoes that loomed over the valley, Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl, weren't just there for decoration. Popocatépetl still erupts even today, and back in Aztec times, it was active enough to spew ash across the entire region. That meant gray dust coating your food, your bed, your hair. People swept constantly, but you could never get rid of it completely. When the dry season hit, things got worse. The lake beds around the city sometimes dried out, leaving behind fine dust that blew through the streets. Combine that with the ever-present smoke, and you've got a recipe for coughing fits. If you had asthma or weak lungs, forget it. You'd be done in days. The Aztecs weren't oblivious. They burned incense like copal resin to make the smell a little nicer, but it didn't make the air any clearer. And when the temple drums started and massive sacrificial fires went up, the entire city filled with a haze you could practically chew. And you couldn't just get away from it. The valley is surrounded by mountains, so the smoke just sat there day after day. You'd wake up coughing, go to work coughing, go to bed coughing. Your eyes would water, your nose would burn, and you'd be hacking up black gunk after a week. For the Aztecs, this was normal. For you, it would feel like living in the middle of a forest fire that never ends. You'd have to adapt or give up, but there was no moving away for cleaner air. This was the heart of the empire, and everyone had to breathe the same smoky sky. So while you might picture Tenochtitlan as some kind of sparkling city on the lake, the truth is it was more like a smoky, gritty, ash-covered metropolis. Step into it, take a deep breath, and immediately regret it.
No pack animals. You know how in every movie about the past, there's someone riding a horse or a donkey pulling a cart of goods down a dusty road? Yeah, not in the Aztec Empire. Here, you were the donkey. The Aztecs didn't have horses, oxen, mules, or any of the big animals that make heavy work easier. Everything, and I mean everything, moved by human power. Picture this. You need to move 50 baskets of maize to the market. There's no wagon waiting outside, no animal to hitch up. Instead, someone shows up with a big wooden frame strapped to his back, a tump line across his forehead, and he loads up as much as he can carry. These guys were called tlames, professional porters, and they were the UPS trucks of the Aztec world. But it wasn't just goods. Construction materials for temples, carried by hand. Tribute payments from far-off towns, carried by hand. Firewood, water jars, even nobles riding in litters, all powered by human backs. If you lived here, there was a good chance you'd spend part of your life bent over with a load of someone else's stuff on your shoulders. This also meant traveling long distances was exhausting. If you wanted to go visit another city, you didn't ride there, you walked. And if you needed supplies along the way, someone walked them there too. Even armies marched everywhere on foot, hauling their own gear. Imagine being a soldier, fighting a battle, and then still having to carry everything home again because there's no horse to help you. And if you think this was just a men's job, think again. Everyone carried loads. Women, kids, whoever was available. Water had to be hauled from the canals every day, firewood dragged from the distant hills, produce carried from the chinampas into the heart of the city. It was endless. Oh, and there was no, let's load it all in one big trip. Loads were limited by what a single person could handle, usually about 50, 60 pounds. That meant entire trains of porters walking in single file, each one dripping with sweat. Mess up your balance on a narrow causeway and splash. Your cargo's gone, and so are you. So when you imagine life in Tenochtitlan, don't picture horses trotting down streets or oxen plowing fields. Instead, picture endless lines of sweaty, hunched-over humans carrying baskets, sacks, and giant bundles like ants in a colony. And if you were there, odds are you'd be one of them. Think your back hurts after sitting at a desk all day? Try carrying a stack of firewood on your shoulders for 5 miles. In the Aztec Empire, the phrase "working like a mule" didn't make sense because you were the mule.
Disease from the land. Think Montezuma's revenge is just a tourist joke? In the Aztec Empire, it was real, and it didn't just ruin your vacation, it ruined you. The water around Tenochtitlan wasn't exactly mountain spring quality. The city sat on the Lake Texcoco, which was shallow, warm, and full of life, including microscopic life you really didn't want inside you. For locals, this was normal. Their bodies had adapted, and they drank the water every day without issue. But you, a newcomer? The second you dipped your gourd into that lake water and took a sip, you'd basically be signing up for weeks of misery. We're talking amoebas, parasites, and bacteria ready to set up camp in your intestines. And the symptoms? Brutal. You'd get cramps, bloating, fevers, and the kind of diarrhea that makes you rethink every life choice you've ever made. There were no bathrooms, so you'd be sprinting to the edge of the chinampa or hiding behind a hut hoping no one saw you. And this wasn't a one-and-done kind of sickness. Some of these parasites caused chronic dysentery, meaning you could be weak and dehydrated for months. Locals had tricks to deal with it. They often boiled water or flavored it with things like chili, which helped kill off some of the germs. They even brewed a sour, slightly alcoholic drink called pulque that was safer than straight water. But until you learned which water source was safe and which wasn't, you'd be gambling with every sip. And Lake Texcoco wasn't just home to germs. Dead animals, human waste, and rotting plants all ended up in the water, especially near the city's edges. During the dry season, water got stagnant, and the smell alone would tell you something was wrong. But if you were thirsty enough, you'd still drink it and pay the price later. This was such a problem for outsiders that some Spanish conquistadors straight up refused to drink anything but wine when they arrived. They knew what would happen if they didn't. But you wouldn't have that luxury. You'd be stuck with whatever water you could find. And here's the kicker. While you were doubled over, clutching your stomach, you'd still be expected to work. No sick days in the Aztec Empire. Your job on the chinampa, in the market, or carrying loads didn't stop just because you couldn't keep food in your system. So if you think the Aztecs' warriors, sacrifices, or strict laws were the scariest part of their world, think again. The lake itself would be your first enemy, and it would hit you right in the gut. In Tenochtitlan, survival started with figuring out how not to spend all day running for the nearest canal.
Volcanic threats. Ever seen a mountain that looks like it's breathing? That's what life was like in the Aztec Empire. The Valley of Mexico had 2 looming giants, Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl, towering over everything like watchful gods. And Popocatépetl wasn't just a pretty backdrop. It was active. Smoke literally poured out of the top, and sometimes it blew its lid hard enough to rain ash all over the valley. Imagine waking up to a sky that's not blue, but gray. Tiny bits of ash drift down like snow, covering your house, your chinampa, and your food. It would crunch under your feet and sting your eyes. The air would smell like sulfur, like a giant campfire mixed with rotten eggs. You'd have to sweep ash off your roof just to keep it from collapsing under the weight. And this wasn't a rare event. There are records of Popocatépetl erupting during Aztec times, shooting ash and fire so high it could be seen for miles. For the Aztecs, this wasn't just geology. It was divine communication. They believed the volcano was tied to their gods, and its anger meant rituals had to be performed to keep disaster away. That meant more sacrifices, more offerings, more fear. Crops were especially vulnerable. Ashfall could destroy entire harvests, smothering maize plants and turning chinampas into gray wastelands. And since maize was the bloodline of the empire, even a small eruption could mean famine. Imagine spending months planting, weeding, and harvesting, only to have it all buried under a layer of volcanic dust overnight. And then there was the psychological weight of living next to something that could wipe you out at any moment. Popocatépetl name literally means smoking mountain, so no one forgot it was there. You'd see it every morning when you stepped outside, this massive, snow-capped peak with a column of smoke curling out of it like it was just waiting. The scary part? There was nowhere to run. The entire valley was a bowl surrounded by mountains. If Popocatépetl had a big eruption, you'd be trapped. Ash would choke the air. Lava and lahars, mud flows, could come roaring down the slopes, and there wouldn't be a safe spot for miles. Even when it wasn't erupting, the volcano reminded people who was in charge. Earthquakes sometimes rattled the valley, and people took them as omens. Priests would rush to the temples to pray and cut themselves, trying to appease the gods before something worse happened. So while the volcano was a symbol of power and beauty, it was also a constant threat. Living under Popocatépetl meant living with one eye on the horizon, wondering if today was the day the mountain decided to end your world.
Swampy mosquito zones. You think you hate mosquitoes now? Try living in the Aztec Empire, where they basically owned the night. The edges of Lake Texcoco were warm, swampy, and perfect breeding grounds for clouds of biting insects. Every sunset, the air came alive with that high-pitched buzzing, the kind that makes you slap your neck every 3 seconds. And these weren't just annoying little pests. These were bloodthirsty swarms. Step near the lake at dusk, and you'd be covered head to toe in bites within minutes. Your skin would be a connect-the-dots puzzle of red welts, itching so bad you'd want to jump back into the lake just to cool off.
Spoiler, that wouldn't help. It would just attract more bugs. The Aztecs knew this was part of daily life. They burned herbs to create smoke, hoping to keep the swarms away. They smeared plant pastes on their skin like early bug repellent. But there was no escaping completely. The wetlands were everywhere, and so were the mosquitoes. And they didn't just make you itch. They could make you sick. Some carried fevers and other nasty diseases that could leave you weak for weeks. If you were already struggling with the altitude or bad water, this was just one more punch in the gut, literally. Fever, chills, body aches, all because a tiny insect decided you looked tasty. Try sleeping through this, by the way. Imagine lying on a reed mat after a long day of hauling firewood, swatting at your face every few seconds. There were no window screens, no air conditioning, no DEET, just you, the dark, and the sound of mosquitoes buzzing in your ears like tiny flying nightmares. And here's the worst part. You couldn't avoid the mosquito zones. The chinampas, the floating gardens that fed the city, were surrounded by shallow water where mosquitoes bred like crazy. Working the fields meant standing in the middle of prime mosquito territory all day long. If you didn't get bitten while harvesting maize, you'd get bitten while hauling mud or paddling home. Even the nobles had to deal with it. Sure, they had bigger houses and servants to wave smoke around them, but nobody was safe from the bugs. When the sun went down, the mosquitoes came out, and the entire city was fair game. So yeah, you might think jaguar warriors or human sacrifices were the scariest part of living in the Aztec Empire, but spend one night out by the chinampas, and you'd be begging for a quick heart extraction just to get away from the mosquitoes. If you ever visit Tenochtitlan in your imagination, bring the strongest bug spray you can dream of, because you'd need it just to survive until morning.
No soap. So here's a weird twist. The Aztecs were actually really clean. Cleaner than most Europeans at the time, in fact. They bathed almost every day, which sounds great until you find out what they bathed with. Forget your gentle lavender-scented shower gel. The Aztecs used plants like amole, a kind of soap root that foams when mixed with water and can sting like crazy on sensitive skin. Daily baths weren't a luxury, they were a rule. People believed washing kept you spiritually pure as well as physically clean. Even commoners were expected to hop in the lake or the local steam bath, called a temazcal, pretty much every day. Skip too many baths, and someone might actually call you out for being dirty, which wasn't just an insult, it was a moral failing. Now, imagine you, a modern outsider, being tossed a handful of crushed soap root and told to scrub up. The stuff worked, sure, but it was rough. It had a natural saponin that foamed when mixed with water and could sting like crazy on sensitive skin. Daily baths weren't luxury, they were boot camp. And there was no bar of soap smell to make you feel cozy after. No vanilla body wash, no fruity shampoo. You'd come out smelling like crushed plants and smoke from the fire that heated the rocks. You'd be clean, sure, but you'd smell like a salad that got left too close to a campfire. The Aztecs took this super seriously. Nobles were expected to keep themselves spotless. Unkempt hair or bad breath could even get you mocked. There are records saying women chewed aromatic tree resin like chewing gum to keep their mouths fresh. You'd better hope you could keep up, because showing up smelly or dirty wasn't just embarrassing, it made you look lazy or even disrespectful to the gods. So, yes, you'd be cleaner than you probably are now, but at a cost. Your skin would be raw, your hair would smell like wet grass, and your idea of me time would turn into a daily boot camp for hygiene. By day 3, you'd be wishing for a bottle of gentle shampoo and a fluffy towel, neither of which existed in Tenochtitlan.
Chili in everything. Think you can handle spicy food? The Aztecs would laugh at you. In their world, chili peppers weren't just a condiment. They were a way of life. Forget salt and pepper. Chili went in everything. And I mean everything. Soups, sauces, stews, even drinks sometimes had a spicy kick. They gave it to their kids, too. Yes, actual toddlers ate chili. If you were dropped into this world, your taste buds wouldn't know what hit them. Let's set the scene. You sit down at a market stall, ready to try some Aztec cuisine. You get a nice, steaming bowl of tamales. They look harmless. Corn dough wrapped in leaves, soft and warm. You take a bite, and suddenly your entire mouth is on fire. Your eyes water, your nose runs, and you're gulping water that's probably not safe to drink. Meanwhile, everyone around you is happily munching away like it's no big deal. The Aztecs didn't treat chili as an optional spice. It was considered one of the basic elements of a meal. They had dozens of varieties, green, red, dried, smoked, and used them to make sauces that ranged from pleasantly warm to burn your face off. Outsiders often couldn't handle it at all, and if your stomach wasn't used to it, well, let's just say you'd be spending a lot of time by the nearest canal. And it wasn't just about flavor. Chili was tied to health and even punishment. Aztecs believed spicy food was good for the body, and they weren't entirely wrong. Chili boosts circulation, clears sinuses, and can even help preserve food. But they also used chili smoke as a form of discipline. Misbehaving kids could literally be forced to inhale burning chili fumes as punishment. Forget being grounded. This was like being pepper sprayed by your parents. Even the drinks weren't safe. Chocolat, the famous Aztec chocolate drink, wasn't sweet. It was bitter and often spiked with chili and spices. You'd take one sip expecting hot cocoa and instead get what feels like a fiery punch to the throat. And here's the kicker. There was no milk to put out the fire. No cheese, no sour cream, no ice cream afterward. Dairy products didn't exist in the Aztec world. You just had to sit there and sweat until your mouth stopped burning, and then do it again at the next meal. So yeah, if you think you're tough because you order medium at the taco place, the Aztecs would have you crying at breakfast. Their kids were tougher than most modern adults when it came to spice. Surviving in Tenochtitlan meant not just learning to fight or work. It meant training your stomach to survive 3 alarm-level meals a day.
Tribute system. Imagine waking up one morning to see government officials in your town square, but instead of taking money, they're writing down how many baskets of corn, rolls of cotton, and live turkeys your community owes. And then they add one more line at the bottom, and 3 young men suitable for sacrifice. That was the Aztec tribute system in action. When the Aztecs conquered a city, they didn't just leave you alone afterward. They immediately turned your entire economy into their personal supply chain. Tribute lists were drawn up, sometimes literally carved into stone, detailing exactly what your town had to send to Tenochtitlan every few months. It could be food, clothing, firewood, weapons, jaguar skins, gold dust, or even cacao beans. Whatever your region produced best, that's what they wanted from you. And these payments weren't small. We're talking tons of goods. Entire caravans of porters would carry tribute into the capital. Long lines of sweating men, bent under giant loads, marching in single file down the causeways like human freight trucks. Tenochtitlan's markets were overflowing with goods from all over Mesoamerica because of this system. The empire stayed rich and well-fed thanks to other people's hard work. But this wasn't just an economic burden. It was a constant reminder of who was in charge. Fail to deliver tribute, and you wouldn't just get a late fee. You'd get a military visit. The Aztecs would send warriors to burn your town, drag off captives, and make an example of you so everyone else kept paying. The scariest part was that tribute sometimes included people. Captives taken in war could be handed over as part of the payment. Some regions were required to send a set number of sacrificial victims to the Great Temple every year. Imagine watching your relatives chosen, knowing exactly where they were going and what would happen to them when they arrived. And the system never let up. It wasn't a one-time penalty. It was forever. Your children and grandchildren would still be paying for a war they weren't even alive to see. And if your community started doing well, guess what? The tribute quota could be raised. Being prosperous just meant the empire squeezed you harder. So living under Aztec rule meant living with a clock constantly ticking in your head. Every harvest, every hunt, every loom in the village was working not just for you, but for the capital far away.
Flower wars. Some wars are fought to take land. Some are fought to gain freedom. The Aztecs fought entire wars just to collect people. These were the infamous flower wars, and if you were unlucky enough to be caught up in one, the goal wasn't to kill you on the battlefield. It was to drag you home alive so your heart could end up on a temple altar. Picture this. You're a farmer from a city-state on the edge of the empire. One morning, runners arrive with terrible news. The Aztecs have declared a flower war. You grab your obsidian club and head to the battlefield. Not because you think you can win, but because your leaders expect you to show up. Both sides meet in an open field, and then it begins. The shouting, the drums, the rush of thousands of warriors clashing together. But this isn't a normal battle. Warriors aren't aiming for quick kills. They're aiming for captures. They try to knock opponents down, trip them, or grab them by the hair and drag them away. Imagine the panic of realizing you've been caught. 4 warriors surrounding you, binding your arms as you kick and scream, knowing what's coming next. These wars weren't small skirmishes either. They were arranged events, almost like grim tournaments. Leaders on both sides agreed to them, sometimes even setting dates and locations. It sounds civilized until you realize what the prize was: human lives. The captured weren't ransomed. They were paraded back to Tenochtitlan, dressed in ritual costumes and sacrificed in front of thousands. For the Aztecs, this was a holy duty. Sacrifice kept the sun rising, the rain falling, and the world from ending. Flower wars guaranteed a steady supply of victims, so the gods were never hungry. But for you, it meant every battle was a death sentence on delay. Losing didn't just mean defeat. It meant your family might watch you march off, never to come home. Even if you were a warrior on the Aztec side, the pressure was intense. Capturing enemies was a mark of honor. The more prisoners you brought back, the higher your rank and the more respect you earned. Fail to capture anyone, and your social standing in society could sink. So everyone fought harder. Knowing their social standing, even their marriage prospects were at stake. Flower wars turned war into a kind of sacred hunt, and every man on the field was both predator and prey. And if you were there, standing in the middle of it all, you wouldn't just fear dying in the fight. You'd fear living long enough to be taken alive.
Constant raids. The Aztecs had the ultimate collections agency, an army. If your town decided not to pay tribute, you wouldn't get a stern letter or a fine. You'd get warriors at your doorstep, and they weren't there to talk. Picture this. Your community has had a bad harvest. The fields are half bare, the stores are low, and there's barely enough food for your own families. The tribute collectors show up with their list anyway, demanding corn, beans, and cloth. The elders tell them it can't be done. The collectors leave without a word, and everyone breathes a sigh of relief. For about 5 minutes. Then you hear the drums. Within days, the Aztec military is marching toward your town, and they're not alone. The army could be tens of thousands strong, including elite jaguar and eagle warriors. When they arrived, there wasn't any polite negotiation. They set fires, tore down buildings, smashed shrines, and killed anyone who resisted. Your job wasn't to win a battle. It was to survive long enough to escape into the hills. The raids weren't just about punishing you. They were about making an example out of you. Once the town was crushed, the Aztecs would rebuild it under their control and reset the tribute quota. Mispayment again, and the whole thing could happen all over. And here's the thing. The Aztecs were really good at this. The armies were fast and organized. Causeways and roads meant they could deploy troops quickly, so there was no hiding. Neighboring towns often joined the raids too, happy to share in the plunder and get on the empire's good side. So when you saw smoke rising in the distance, you knew it was already too late. Imagine what that did to your nerves. Every time tribute season comes around, you'd be living with a pit in your stomach. Even if you paid, you'd worry about bandits or disasters ruining your shipment, because if the goods didn't arrive in Tenochtitlan, it was still your problem. The fear of raids kept everyone in line, generation after generation. And if you happen to be captured in one of these raids, well, congratulations. You might just earn yourself a one-way trip to the Great Temple for a little spiritual service. The Aztecs never wasted a good prisoner. So surviving in the Aztec Empire wasn't just about living through wars. It was about living through the constant threat of war.
Your entire town had to stay on the empire's good side, or risk being turned into a smoking ruin by the end of the week.
Rigid hierarchy. Ever felt stuck at your job because there's no room to move up? In the Aztec Empire, there was a way to climb the ladder, but it usually involved dragging someone back from the battlefield, alive and kicking. Aztec society was like a pyramid, and you were somewhere near the bottom unless you were born lucky. At the top were the nobles, the pipiltin, who held land, power, and all the good jobs. Below them were the commoners, the masihualtin, who farmed, paid tribute, and did most of the hard labor. Then came serfs, who worked other people's land, and finally slaves, who were at the very bottom. The catch? You weren't totally stuck where you were. The Aztecs believed that social status could be earned, but not through hard work at a market stall. The fastest way up was by becoming a warrior and proving yourself in battle. Here's the scary part. Your rank wasn't based on how many enemies you killed alive. It was based on how many you captured alive. Capture one, and you might earn a special cape or a feathered headdress. Capture 4 or 5, and you could rise to the rank of jaguar or eagle warrior, dine with nobles, and even own land. Fail to capture anyone, and you'd stay at the bottom forever. That meant enormous pressure. Every battle wasn't just about survival, it was about your future. You'd charge into enemy lines, knowing that if you came home empty-handed, you weren't just a poor fighter. You were stuck in the same social class until you died. No glory, no respect, no perks. And loyalty was just as important. Show any sign of disobedience to the state or the emperor, and you could lose what little you had. The Aztecs took respect seriously. Commoners were expected to bow their heads in front of nobles, avoid looking them in the eye, and step off the road to let them pass. Break these rules, and you might face punishment, even death. So life under this hierarchy was a constant balancing act. You could, in theory, rise up, but you had to risk your life to do it. And if you failed, everyone would know. Imagine trying to live under that kind of pressure. Every young man was expected to train as a warrior, and your entire family's honor rested on your performance. It wasn't just about survival. It was about proving yourself worthy every single time you stepped onto the battlefield. In short, social mobility in the Aztec Empire wasn't earned by grinding away at school or building a career. It was earned by dragging screaming prisoners home in front of cheering crowds. And if you weren't up for that, well, hope you like farming, because that's where you'd stay.
Elite nobility. In the Aztec Empire, nobles weren't just rich people in fancy houses. They were walking laws. They were called the pipiltin, and they lived on a completely different level than commoners. For them, privilege was absolute. For you, one wrong move around them could literally cost your life. Picture this. You're walking down a narrow causeway when a noble approaches in a feathered cloak, attendants carrying parasols to shield him from the sun. You're expected to lower your head, step aside, and avoid direct eye contact. Forgetting any of those things wasn't just bad manners, it was dangerous. Disrespecting a noble could mean harsh punishment, even execution. The pipiltin lived in large decorated houses while commoners squeezed into simple huts. They wore cotton clothes dyed with vibrant colors, while you wore plain manguai fiber garments that scratched your skin. They ate rich meals with turkey, chocolate, and delicacies from all over the empire. You? Corn, beans, and maybe a few chili peppers to make it edible. And their power wasn't just social. Nobles controlled the land, the tribute, and the justice system. If you were accused of a crime against a noble, good luck defending yourself. Courts were stacked against commoners. The penalty for stealing from a noble, insulting one, or ignoring their orders was often death. In some cases, your entire family could be punished alongside you. Even daily interactions were filled with tension. A commoner wasn't supposed to sit in the same place as a noble, use the same kinds of household items, or speak casually in their presence. If a noble offered you food, you had to accept it carefully and show gratitude, or risk insulting them. Every detail mattered, and the gap between classes was visible everywhere. Nobles had access to special schools where their children learned poetry, philosophy, and advanced military training. Commoners, meanwhile, learned farming, basic warfare, and obedience. It wasn't that you couldn't dream of rising higher, but unless you captured enough enemies in war to earn promotion, your path was sealed. But here's the twist. Nobles weren't immune from pressure themselves. They were expected to set an example, live with dignity, and perform ritual duties. If a noble disgraced himself badly enough, he could lose land or status. Still, even disgraced nobles were usually treated better than the average hard-working farmer. So surviving among the Aztec Pipiltin wasn't about how strong you were or how hard you worked. It was about knowing your place and never stepping out of line. One wrong word, one slip of the eyes, one hint of disrespect, and you could find yourself dragged away for punishment. In modern life, you might complain about bosses or politicians having too much privilege. But in the Aztec world, nobles didn't just hold power over your paycheck. They held power over your life, and they weren't afraid to use it.
Political intrigue. If you thought Game of Thrones was ruthless, the Aztec nobility could give it a run for its money. Behind the dazzling feathered headdresses, glittering jewelry, and poetry recitals was a world of whispers, backstabbing, and deadly paranoia. Because in Tenochtitlan, if someone accused you of plotting against the state, you weren't just losing your job, you were losing your head. Life among the Pipiltin, the elite nobles, wasn't just about enjoying power. It was about constantly proving loyalty to the emperor and watching every word you said. Nobles spied on each other, eager to curry favor with the throne. A careless comment at a feast or a private joke about the wrong priest could be twisted into evidence of treason. And treason wasn't just frowned upon, it was punishable by death. Imagine sitting at a banquet in a noble's home. The tables are piled with turkey meat, tamales, and frothy cacao drinks. Everyone is smiling, toasting to the emperor's health. But behind those smiles, you can feel it. Someone's watching, listening for a slip-up. Maybe the warrior seated next to you wants your land. Maybe the scribe across the table is hoping to rise in rank by reporting your disloyalty. The food tastes rich, but the air tastes like fear. And once suspicion fell on you, there was no easy escape. Trials were harsh,
and evidence was often based on witness testimony, which could be faked, exaggerated, or bought. If the emperor or high priests decided you were a threat, you could be seized, stripped of your titles, and executed in front of the city. Sometimes your family paid the price too, their lands confiscated as a warning. This meant noble life was a balancing act. You had to be ambitious enough to stay relevant, but not so ambitious that others thought you were gunning for the emperor's seat. You had to form alliances, but not with the wrong faction. You had to host feasts and act generous, but never let generosity look like rebellion. Even religion was political. Priests held enormous influence, and failing to support the right rituals could brand you as impious, another form of treason. Imagine missing a sacrifice ceremony because you were sick, and then hearing rumors that you'd lost faith in the gods. That little whisper could snowball into your downfall. For commoners, nobles looked untouchable, but inside the palaces, every day was survival. Wealth, land, and prestige weren't enough if you didn't also master the art of silence, loyalty, and strategic flattery. The walls had ears, and the ears had knives.
Punishment for laziness. Picture waking up late, deciding to skip work on your little patch of farmland, and coming home to find your house smashed to pieces. That was the Aztec approach to motivating people. Laziness wasn't just frowned upon, it was a crime, and the punishment could be extreme. Every commoner family had a plot of land called a kalpulli field. It wasn't technically yours, it belonged to your clan, but you were expected to farm it, keep it productive, and pay your share of tribute from the harvest. Skip too many days, let weeds take over, or leave the soil fallow without permission, and your neighbors would notice. And they wouldn't just gossip about it. Local officials were responsible for keeping everyone working. If you were caught neglecting your duties, you might first get a warning or a public scolding. But repeat offenders? Their homes could be torn down as an example. Imagine the humiliation of watching neighbors rip the roof off your house, smash your cooking pots, and scatter your mats in the streets while everyone watched. The message was clear: work or you don't deserve a place to live. And this wasn't an empty threat. The Aztec society depended on everyone pulling their weight. Tribute had to be paid, markets had to be stocked, and the empire's massive population had to be fed. A lazy farmer didn't just hurt himself, he hurt the whole system. So the punishment wasn't just personal, it was public. You became a cautionary tale. And it didn't stop there. Chronic laziness could lead to enslavement. Yes, you could literally be sold off as a slave if you refused to contribute. The Aztecs believed idleness was a kind of moral rot, something that offended the gods. Work wasn't just an economic duty, it was a religious one. Parents drilled this into kids from an early age. Children were taught to wake up before dawn, sweep the house, carry water, and help in the fields.
If they refused, there were punishments like chili smoke blown into their eyes and noses, guaranteed to make them cry and think twice before skipping chores again. For you, living under this system would feel like constant surveillance. Miss a day in the field, someone would notice. Fall behind on weeding, someone would report it. And the punishment wouldn't just affect you, your whole family could suffer the shame. So surviving here wasn't just about avoiding war or disease. It was about keeping your house moving day after day. No excuses. Your home's survival literally depended on your work ethic. Skip too many mornings, and you'd be standing in a pile of rubble wondering why you ever thought sleeping in was worth it.
Harsh laws. Grab a piece of fruit from someone else's tree? In the Aztec Empire, that little snack could be the last thing you ever ate. Their legal system didn't mess around. Even minor crimes, like petty theft, were often punished with death. And it was public, so everyone could see what happened to people who broke the rules. The Aztecs believed that order was everything. The empire was huge, with dozens of conquered cities, and keeping people in line required strict laws. They had an entire class of judges who oversaw legal disputes, and their decisions were final. There were no appeals, no drawn-out trials. Once they gave a sentence, it was carried out quickly. And the punishments were severe. Steal from the market, you could be beaten, enslaved, or executed. Lie to an official, same thing. Cheat on your spouse, that could also mean death. And in some cases, the execution was designed to humiliate you first. Property crimes were treated as especially serious. Crops were life or death in this society. So if you stole food, you weren't just taking from one person. You were threatening the community's survival. First-time offenders might get off easier if they could repay double what they stole. But if you were caught again, you were done for. And this wasn't done in secret. Punishments were often public to send a message. Executions could be carried out in the marketplace where everyone could watch. Picture standing in the crowd while a thief was strangled or beaten to death, knowing that the same thing could happen to you if you ever got caught. Even drunkenness had strict penalties. For nobles, being seen drunk in public could get them executed. For commoners, it was allowed only during certain festivals. Get caught drunk outside of those times, and you could lose your house or your life. The idea was to keep society disciplined and orderly, with no room for chaos. And here's the really intense part. These laws applied to everyone, even nobles. A noble caught committing a crime could face an even harsher punishment than a commoner. So if you were at the top, you lived with constant pressure not to mess up. One slip, and you could be disgraced or killed. So living under Aztec law wasn't just about avoiding big crimes. It was about watching every move you made. You'd have to be careful with what you took, what you said, how you behaved in public, and even how much you drank. Modern laws might feel strict sometimes, but at least you don't risk execution for stealing your neighbor's corn.
In Tenochtitlan, one bad decision could cost you your freedom, your reputation, and your life, all before sunset.
Mandatory sacrifice. Imagine waking up at dawn, stretching, and then calmly taking a sharp obsidian blade to your own skin. That wasn't horror movie stuff. That was a normal morning in the Aztec Empire. Everyone from farmers to priests to nobles was expected to spill a little blood every day to keep the gods happy. This practice was called auto-sacrifice, and it wasn't optional. The Aztecs believed their gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world and keep the sun moving, so humans had to repay that debt constantly. Blood was considered a sacred fuel. Without it, the universe could literally collapse. And they didn't just prick a finger. Men would pierce their ears, calves, or tongues with sharp thorns or obsidian knives, letting the blood drip onto special paper that was later burned as an offering. Some of the most devout, or unlucky, would even pierce their genitals, drawing blood as the ultimate act of devotion. The pain wasn't an accident. It was part of the gift. This wasn't a once-a-year ritual either. Daily bloodletting was woven into life. Before eating, before planting crops, before major ceremonies. Even children were sometimes expected to draw blood to honor the gods. Your family, your neighbors, and your leaders all participated. So if you refused, you'd stand out, and not in a good way. Nobles were under the most pressure. They were supposed to lead by example, showing off their devotion with dramatic acts of bloodletting during festivals. It wasn't unusual to see high-ranking warriors or priests with fresh wounds, calmly bleeding while music and drums played. And this was just the DIY version of sacrifice. On top of personal bloodletting, entire communities had to provide victims for the larger, more dramatic sacrifices, the ones where hearts were cut out atop the Templo Mayor. Living under this system meant you were never really safe. You might not be the next victim, but you knew someone would be. For a modern outsider, this would be almost impossible to stomach. Imagine holding a thorn in your hand every morning, knowing you were expected to draw blood before breakfast, and that everyone would notice if you didn't. The sight of blood would stop being shocking after a while, but the sting, the fear, and the pressure would never completely go away. And that was the point. Auto-sacrifice reminded everyone of their place in the cosmic order. You are small, the gods are everything, and your pain keeps the world alive. So, if you ever found yourself in Tenochtitlan, survival wouldn't just mean keeping your heart beating. It would mean offering a little of that heart every day, one cut at a time.
Heart extraction. You're standing at the bottom of a massive stone temple. Drums are pounding so hard you feel them in your chest. The crowd is silent, watching as a line of captives is marched up the steep stairs. At the top, priests wait with obsidian knives that can slice like glass.
You know exactly what's about to happen, and there's no looking away. Heart extraction wasn't some rare, secret ritual. It was one of the most important ceremonies in the Aztec Empire. They believed the sun needed human hearts to keep moving across the sky. If it wasn't fed, darkness and chaos would consume the world. So sacrifices were seen as cosmic maintenance, horrifying but necessary. The victim would be laid on a stone altar, usually held down by 4 priests so he couldn't move. Then, with a single swift motion, the high priest would cut open the chest with a razor-sharp obsidian blade and reach in to pull out the still-beating heart. The heart would be held up toward the sky, an offering to the sun god who was still a pochli, and then burned or placed on a special vessel. And this wasn't a once-in-a-while thing. Large ceremonies could mean dozens or even hundreds of victims in a single day. During the dedication of the Great Temple, some accounts say thousands were sacrificed over several days. Their bodies rolled down the steps like grisly reminders of the gods' hunger. The entire city participated. This was a public spectacle. People filled the plaza. Merchants closed their stalls. Families came to watch. There would be music, chanting, incense, and feasting. It wasn't just about death. It was a cosmic celebration, a way of proving that the Aztecs were literally keeping the world alive. But if you were a prisoner being led up those steps, the terror would be indescribable. The temple stairs were steep, designed to make the climb slow and dramatic. You'd hear the drums, smell the copal incense, and know exactly what was waiting at the top. By the time you reached the altar, your heart would already be racing, which was perfect, because the priests wanted it strong and beating when they offered it. For a modern person, the idea is almost impossible to process. This wasn't a secret horror. It was part of normal life. You could wake up in the morning, go to the market, and then watch a row of captives have their hearts removed before lunch. And the scariest part, everyone believed it worked. Without those hearts, the sun might not rise tomorrow. So surviving in the Aztec Empire meant living with the knowledge that your turn could come at any time, and that everyone around you would cheer when it did, because you just saved the world.
Flaying festivals. Picture walking through the streets of Tenochtitlan during spring, when the air smells of flowers, food, and rotting flesh. That's because this was the season of Tlacaxipewalistli, the Flaying of Men festival, one of the Aztecs' most haunting ceremonies. During this ritual, sacrificial victims weren't just killed, they were skinned, and then their skins were worn by dancers, priests, and sometimes even family members of the very people who had captured them in battle. The festival honored the god Xipetotec, the flayed lord, a deity connected with fertility, renewal, and the cycle of life and death. The Aztecs believed that just as corn sheds its husk and snakes shed their skin, humans had to symbolically shed theirs to renew the earth. The result? A celebration where human skins became sacred
costumes. Here's how it happened. Captured warriors were brought to the temple and sacrificed, often by having their hearts cut out. Their bodies were then carefully flayed, the skin removed in large pieces. Priests or warriors would take these skins, slip into them like grotesque suits, and parade through the city. The sight was terrifying. A human figure walking around covered head to toe in the pale, loose skin of another person, sometimes with the face still attached like a mask. And this wasn't some hidden ritual in a temple corner. The wearers of the skins went into public spaces, marketplaces, plazas, even people's homes. They danced, they sang, and they gave blessings. Ordinary people were expected to treat them as living embodiments of the god, touching the skins for good luck, or even making offerings. The skins were worn until they began to decay, which could take several days. Imagine the smell in the hot valley of Mexico's sun, the flies buzzing around, the sickly sweet odor of human flesh hanging in the air while children and elders alike watched the dancers. For the Aztecs, this wasn't horrifying. It was sacred. For you, it would feel like a waking nightmare. The message was clear. Life came from death, and the earth's fertility required sacrifice. Just as seeds had to die to sprout, humans had to shed their skin to bring renewal. But it wasn't symbolic to the Aztecs, it was literal. Surviving in this society meant living alongside rituals that blurred the line between devotion and horror. You might wake up, grind maize for breakfast, and then watch a parade of priests wearing freshly skinned human hides stroll past your door. It was normal for them, but you'd never stop seeing it when you closed your eyes at night. So while Tlacaxipewalistli celebrated rebirth and the promise of new crops, for an outsider, it would feel like stepping into a nightmare carnival, where the dancers smiled through someone else's face.
Cannibalism. You sit down at a feast, ready to dig into tamales and stew, and someone casually tells you the meat in the pot came from a man sacrificed earlier that day. In the Aztec Empire, this wasn't a horror story. It was a sacred meal. Cannibalism in Aztec society wasn't about starvation or savagery. It was ceremonial. After certain sacrifices, the victim's flesh would be cooked and eaten by priests, nobles, or the warrior who captured them. This was called Nestlahuali, meaning payment of debt, because the victim's life was considered an offering to the gods. Sharing their flesh was a way of honoring that sacrifice and symbolically sharing divine power. But don't picture giant feasts with piles of human meat. This wasn't a free-for-all. The portions were small, often mixed with maize or served in a spicy stew. It was about ritual, not gluttony. Think of it like a terrifying version of communion. Everyone participating in a sacred act, not a banquet. Still, for a modern outsider, the idea is chilling. Imagine watching the whole process. The victim sacrificed at the temple, their body carried down, then taken to a noble's house where it was carefully butchered, cooked, and shared among select guests. You'd sit there, heart pounding, wondering if it would be rude to say no. And this wasn't some fringe practice. It happened during major festivals, especially those dedicated to gods like Huitzilopochtli. The belief was that by consuming the flesh, people were taking in the strength and divine energy of the offering. It was literally eating holiness, and that made it a privilege, not a punishment. The Aztecs didn't see this as grotesque. To them, it was part of the sacred cycle. The gods gave life, humans gave life back, and by consuming part of that life, the living were renewed. It was serious, reverent, and structured, not some chaotic act of desperation. But let's be honest, you'd probably lose your mind if you were there. One bite of human stew, and you'd never look at a bowl of soup the same way again. And there was no polite way out. Refusing to participate might be seen as an insult to the gods or a rejection of the community's sacred duty. So, surviving the Aztec Empire wasn't just about escaping sacrifice yourself, it was about living with the knowledge that ritual cannibalism was normal, celebrated, and even expected. You wouldn't just watch people being sacrificed, you might literally taste the aftermath.
Gladiator sacrifice. The crowd roars. Drums thunder. In the middle of the temple courtyard stands a lone captured warrior, tied by one ankle to a massive stone disc. In his hands, a wooden club with paper blades. Across from him, 4 Aztec jaguar warriors approach, armed with real weapons and ready to spill blood. The match is about to begin, and you already know how it ends. This grim spectacle was called the gladiator sacrifice, and it was one of the most dramatic rituals in the Aztec world. Captured warriors were brought to the center of the city and forced to fight for their lives in front of a screaming audience. But here's the catch. Their weapons were fake. Instead of a razor-sharp macuayo, the deadly obsidian-edged club that could take off a limb in one swing, the captive got a version with soft wooden edges, or even feathers. It looked like a weapon, but couldn't do real damage. The idea wasn't to give him a fair chance. It was to test his courage and entertain the crowd before the inevitable sacrifice. And the crowd loved it. This wasn't a quiet ritual. People packed the plaza to watch the fight. The captive would sometimes manage to dodge, parry, and even land a few blows, but eventually the warriors would wear him down. Some accounts say that if a prisoner actually defeated all his opponents, he might be set free, but that was so rare it became legend. For most, the game always ended the same way. The captive was subdued, dragged to the temple steps, and sacrificed on the altar. This wasn't just cruelty for cruelty's sake. To the Aztecs, this was sacred theater. The lone fighter represented the god Tezcatlipoca, who was often depicted as a powerful warrior destined to die. His courage in the face of certain death was a spiritual offering, proving that bravery itself could nourish the gods. But put yourself in that captive's sandals for a second. You're tied to a giant stone, surrounded by enemies, and your only hope of survival is to fight like a god with a weapon that might as well be a stick. Your heart is pounding, sweat is pouring down your face, and you know the whole city is watching to see how well you die. For the Aztecs, this was a celebration, a mix of sports event, religious ritual, and public execution. For you, it would be the most terrifying match of your life. So if you ever thought modern sports were brutal,
Just be glad you're not stepping into an Aztec gladiator ring. Because in this game, the loser didn't just go home empty-handed. He went home without a heartbeat.
Child sacrifice. Some prayers are whispered. Some are sung. In the Aztec Empire, some were cried by children on their way to die. During ceremonies for the rain god Tlaloc, children were sacrificed, not because the Aztecs were cruel for cruelty's sake, but because they believed those tears would literally bring rain. This was no rare event. Droughts were deadly in the Valley of Mexico, and famine could wipe out entire communities. The Aztecs believed that Tlaloc required child victims to open the skies. Their tears were seen as sacred, a sign the god had accepted the offering. Priests even went out of their way to make sure the children cried before the sacrifice. If they didn't cry naturally, their nails might be pricked, or they'd be shown terrifying idols to bring on the tears. The ceremonies were elaborate. Victims were dressed in special clothing, often in blue or green to represent water and fertility. They were paraded through the city so everyone could see them, hear them crying, and join in the ritual. This wasn't hidden away in some dark corner. It was public, solemn, and believed to be necessary for the survival of the entire population. The sacrifices didn't just happen in one place either. Some were conducted at the Templo Mayor in Tenochtitlan, others at sacred sites like Mount Tlaloc, where offerings were made directly to the god in the mountains where rain clouds formed. The entire empire could be mobilized to gather victims and perform these rituals when drought threatened the harvest. This wasn't just about fear, it was about reciprocity. They believed the gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world, and humans had to give life back in return. A child's death was seen as the ultimate gift, ensuring that everyone else could eat. It was tragic, but it was sacred. But for a modern outsider, this would be almost unbearable to watch. Imagine standing in a plaza filled with silent spectators, hearing the sobs of children dressed in ceremonial costumes, knowing they were being led to their deaths, and seeing everyone around you nodding solemnly as though this was right and good. Even after the ritual ended, the sight would stay with you. The little bodies offered to the god, the priests holding up their hearts to the sky, the crowd waiting for rain that might not even come. It was a mix of faith, fear, and desperation. And for the Aztecs, it was the price of survival. Living under this system meant you were never far from the possibility that a child you knew, or even your own, might be chosen if times were bad enough. You didn't just pray for rain. You prayed it would come soon enough that no one else had to cry for it.
Templo terrors. The first thing you'd notice at the Templo Mayor wasn't its size, it was the smell. The great temple in the heart of Tenochtitlan wasn't just a towering pyramid. It was the empire's beating heart, where hundreds, sometimes thousands of lives ended. After a big ceremony, the wide stone stairs would run slick with blood, turning the temple into a gruesome waterfall of red. The Templo Mayor was the Aztecs' most sacred site, dedicated to two powerful gods, Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun, and Tlaloc, the god of rain. It had twin temples at the top, which meant double the sacrifices during major festivals. Victims were marched up the steep steps, laid on the altar, and had their hearts cut out in front of massive crowds. Then their bodies were rolled back down the stairs, where they left a literal trail behind them. Imagine standing at the bottom, looking up as body after body tumbles down, thudding against the stone. The steps glisten in the sun, but not from water. People would have to hose the stairs down with buckets, but there was always a stain left behind, darkening the stone. Some Spanish conquistadors, who later saw the temple, said the smell of dried blood hit them before they even reached the plaza. This wasn't a rare sight. The Aztecs held dozens of major festivals throughout the year, and many of them included mass sacrifices. During the dedication of the Templo Mayor in 1487, some records claim that thousands of prisoners were sacrificed over several days, one after another, in an endless, horrifying procession. The city turned into a giant ritual theater, and the temple stairs were the main stage. But for the Aztecs, this wasn't horror, it was salvation. Each heart offered kept the sun moving and the world safe. The bloody stairs weren't a sign of cruelty, but of cosmic duty fulfilled. People didn't turn away in fear. They watched with pride, celebrating their city's power and their god's favor. Still, if you were a visitor or a captive, this would be nightmare fuel. The sight, the smell, the sound of drums and chants filling the air, it would all tell you one thing. This is what happens if you resist, if you are conquered, if you fail to please the gods.
Priesthood training. You think becoming a priest means sitting in quiet temples and chanting all day. In the Aztec Empire, priest training was closer to a survival boot camp, and most people wouldn't last a week. If you were chosen as an acolyte, your life stopped belonging to you. From childhood or adolescence, you'd be sent to live in a temple school where you'd be shaped or broken into a servant of the gods. The training was brutal. Days began before sunrise with prayers and offerings. Meals were small and deliberately plain, mostly bland corn gruel, and sometimes you were expected to fast for days to prove your devotion. And fasting was just the start. Pain was considered a path to purity, so you'd spend nights sleeping on hard mats or even on the cold stone floor. Forget warm blankets. Some trainees were made to sleep outside, shivering under the stars to toughen their spirit. Others had to wake repeatedly during the night to pray, leaving them permanently exhausted. Then came the bloodletting. Acolytes were expected to pierce their ears, arms, legs, or tongues regularly to offer blood to the gods. You do this yourself with obsidian or maguey thorns, sharp, painful, and messy. The older priests would watch to make sure you bled enough, because too little meant you weren't truly committed. And it wasn't just physical suffering. You were expected to memorize hymns, rituals, and complex calendars. Mistakes could bring harsh punishments, from beatings to public humiliation.
The pressure was constant because priesthood was one of the most respected roles in Aztec society, and failure to meet its standards was a disgrace. On top of all that, you were responsible for temple maintenance, sweeping floors, keeping fires lit, and preparing sacrificial victims. Yes, part of your training meant helping with rituals, including washing the blood off altars after sacrifices. Imagine being 12 years old, scrubbing a stone slab while the smell of iron and incense fills your nose. All of this was meant to transform you. Hunger, pain, and exhaustion weren't punishments. They were lessons. You were learning to put duty above comfort, to sacrifice yourself a little each day so you'd be ready to serve the gods completely. By the time you completed training, you were supposed to be fearless, disciplined, and spiritually clean. For you, though, this would feel like living in a non-stop endurance trial. There were no cheat days, no breaks, no mental health days. The temple owns your body, your mind, and your time. So surviving priesthood training wasn't about memorizing prayers. It was about learning to bleed, starve, and hurt without complaint. And if you couldn't handle that, the gods didn't want you, and neither did the temple.
Sky-high offerings. The temple stairs weren't just a path, they were a countdown. Imagine standing at the bottom of the Templo Mayor, hearing the drums pound as you're led to the first step. Each one takes you higher, closer to the top where the priests wait. And if you weren't chosen for a heart sacrifice, there was another fate waiting, being thrown back down alive. Some Aztec rituals didn't end with a clean cut. Instead, the victims were offered to the gods by being hurled from the top of the temple, tumbling down dozens of steep, jagged steps before crashing to the stone courtyard below. It wasn't quick, it wasn't merciful, and it turned the entire staircase into part of the ritual. This type of offering was often linked to gods of rain, fertility, or renewal, a dramatic way of returning the victim to the earth. The idea was that their body would break open like a seed, nourishing the land. The fall itself became symbolic, the victim's body transforming as it struck the steps. And yes, people watched. The entire city could gather to see it happen. The temple plaza would be packed, the air heavy with incense smoke, as the victim climbed under guard. By the time they reached the summit, the crowd below had gone silent, waiting. Then, with a final shout or prayer, the priests would push them. The sound of a body hitting stone step after stone step must have been unforgettable, a sickening rhythm that echoed across the plaza. By the time the victim landed, the steps would be smeared with blood, a visible sign of the offering. Sometimes the body was later collected and ritually buried, completing the act. For the Aztecs, this wasn't seen as cruelty, but as theater, a divine spectacle to please the gods and remind everyone watching of their place in the cosmic order. The height of the temple made the act dramatic and visible to all, ensuring that no one could miss the message: the gods demand sacrifice, and the city obeys. For you, though, it would be unbearable. Just climbing those steps would make your heart race, knowing what was about to happen. You'd hear the crowd below go quiet, feel the wind whip around you at the top, and know that there was no coming back. And even if you weren't the one on the stairs, just watching would leave a mark. You'd walk past the temple later and still see the red streaks on the stone, still hear the thud in your head. In the Aztec Empire, the temple wasn't just a place of worship. It was a place where gravity itself became a weapon, and survival meant never being the one chosen to take that final fall.
New fire ceremony. Imagine living your whole life knowing that one night, when you were middle-aged, the entire world might just stop. Every fire and every home is put out. The whole valley goes dark. People huddle in silence, staring at the black sky, waiting to see if the sun will rise, or if this is the night everything ends. This was the new fire ceremony, one of the most dramatic rituals in Aztec religion. It happened every 52 years when their two main calendars, the solar year and the ritual year, aligned. To the Aztecs, this wasn't just a neat date on the calendar. It was a moment of cosmic danger. They believed that if they didn't perform the right ritual, the sun might refuse to rise again, plunging the world into eternal darkness. The ceremony began with the total extinguishing of fire. Every hearth in Tenochtitlan, every torch, every temple flame was deliberately put out. The city became eerily silent and pitch black, with only the moon and stars above. People destroyed their old household goods, clothing, pots, even tools to symbolize the end of one cycle. Families stayed awake all night, fasting, praying, and waiting. Far from the city, priests climbed a sacred hill called Huaysaxtion. There they prepared the most important fire in history. At midnight, a sacrificial victim was placed on a stone altar, and his chest was opened with an obsidian blade. The high priest then lit a new fire in the cavity of his chest, using a fire drill until sparks ignited. If the fire caught, cheers erupted. The world had been renewed, the sun would rise, and the cycle could begin again. Runners would carry torches lit from the sacred flame back into the city, relighting the temple fires, then the neighborhood braziers, then every hearth. By morning, Tenochtitlan would glow again, reborn, cleansed, and alive. But if the fire failed, people believed the sun would die and monstrous creatures would descend from the sky to devour humanity. The anxiety must have been unbearable. A whole civilization holding its breath, waiting for one spark. For the Aztecs, this ritual was one of the most awe-inspiring events of their lifetime. For you, standing in that darkness, it would feel like the end of the world. Every sound would feel amplified, every star above you sharper. When the fire finally caught, the relief would be overwhelming, not just because the night was over, but because you truly believed you just watched the world get saved. Survival here wasn't just about food or war. It was about surviving cosmic dread. Every 52 years, you had to face the possibility of total annihilation and trust that one ritual, one sacrifice, would keep the universe spinning.
Macuahuitl weapons. What kind of weapon can cut like a sword, smash like a club, and is made out of wood? Meet the Macuahuitl, the Aztec superweapon that could literally take a man's head off in a single swing. At first, it doesn't look terrifying. It's just a flat wooden club, about 3 to 4 feet long,
almost paddle-shaped. But here's the kicker. The edges weren't just wood. They were lined with razor-sharp blades of obsidian, volcanic glass sharper than modern surgical steel. These blades were set into grooves along the sides, turning the makuahito into a hybrid between a sword and a chainsaw. When an Aztec warrior swung one of these things, it wasn't just to bruise you, it was to slice you open. Spanish conquistadors were shocked by what they saw. There are accounts of makuahitos decapitating horses in battle, which is a horrifying level of cutting power for a wooden club. Imagine the kind of force it would deliver to a human neck or arm. But here's where it gets even scarier. Warriors didn't always swing for a clean kill. Because capturing enemies alive was more valuable, they often aimed for disabling blows, a slash to the legs to bring you down, or a strike across the shoulder to make you drop your weapon. Then, once you were too injured to fight, they'd pounce and tie you up. And this wasn't a one-use weapon. The obsidian blades could be replaced when they dulled, so a makuahito could be kept in perfect, terrifying condition. Warriors decorated their weapons with feathers and carvings, turning them into symbols of status as well as tools of war. Imagine standing on a battlefield, hearing that distinct whoosh of wood cutting through the air, and knowing one hit could split you open like paper. Even if you blocked it, the obsidian could shatter, sending glass-like shards flying into your skin. And if you survived that, congratulations! You'd probably still be bleeding badly enough to be dragged off as a prisoner anyway. The makuahito was the perfect weapon for the Aztec style of warfare, powerful enough to terrify enemies, precise enough to allow for live captures, and brutal enough to keep their empire fed with sacrifices. For a modern person, the sight of one would be enough to make you back up fast. It looks primitive, sure, but one swing would convince you it's anything but. So while we think of swords as elegant and clubs as crude, the makuahito was both, elegant in design, devastating in effect. If you ever found yourself facing a warrior with one, you wouldn't just fear death. You'd fear being left alive, bleeding, and very much captured.
Jaguar and Eagle Warriors. You're standing on a battlefield when you see them. Men dressed head to toe in jaguar skins, their helmets shaped like snarling cat heads, teeth bared. Beside them, warriors in feathered suits gleamed like living birds of prey. The sight isn't just intimidating, it's a message. You're already caught. These were the Jaguar and Eagle Warriors, the Aztec Empire's elite fighters. They weren't just soldiers, they were living symbols of power, trained from childhood to be relentless hunters of men. Every Aztec boy went through basic warrior training, but only the best, the ones who captured enemy warriors alive, could rise to these prestigious orders. Becoming a Jaguar or Eagle warrior wasn't easy. You had to prove yourself again and again on the battlefield by bringing back captives. Each prisoner was like a trophy, and 4 successful captures could earn you the right to wear the jaguar pelt or the eagle feathers. These warriors had privileges other soldiers could only dream of. They could dine in the palace, drink pulque, the sacred alcoholic drink, freely, and wear gold jewelry and bright colors reserved for the elite.
Their appearance alone was enough to strike fear. Jaguar warriors wore full-body suits of spotted jaguar skin, with helmets shaped like open jaws that made them look half man, half beast. Eagle warriors wore suits covered in feathers and helmets shaped like eagle heads, symbolizing the sun. To their enemies, they weren't just men, they were predators. And they fought like predators, too. Their job wasn't just to kill, it was to stalk, to capture, to dominate. They used the makuito with precision, going for disabling strikes that left you alive but helpless. Once they had you, they dragged you off the field, your fate sealed. Even outside battle, they were feared. Their role was to enforce the will of the empire. If tribute wasn't paid, jaguar and eagle warriors could lead the raids to remind your town who was in charge. The sight of one walking into your village meant trouble. For you, running into them would be a nightmare. These weren't random fighters you could outrun or outfight. They were the best of the best, disciplined, fast, and completely loyal to the empire. If they set their sights on you, it wasn't a question of if you'd be caught, only when. So while regular Aztec soldiers were dangerous enough, jaguar and eagle warriors were something worse, professional hunters whose prey was human. Seeing them charge across the battlefield in their animal suits would be the last image you'd want to have, because it usually meant you'd be climbing the temple stairs by sunset.
Human trophies. Imagine walking through the heart of Tenochtitlan and coming face to face with a wall of skulls, row after row, dozens deep, all grinning back at you. This wasn't a nightmare. This was the Tzompantli, the skull rack, one of the Aztecs' most chilling displays of power. After a battle or a large sacrificial ceremony, the heads of victims weren't just tossed aside. They were cleaned, the flesh removed, and the skulls were pierced through the sides. Then they were strung on horizontal poles, stacked into massive wooden racks. Each pole held dozens of skulls, and the racks stretched as far as the eye could see. These weren't hidden away. The Tzompantli was usually set up near the Templo Mayor, right where everyone could see it. Visitors to the city, traders, ambassadors, even enemies were greeted by the sight of hundreds, sometimes thousands of skulls staring out across the plaza. The smell must have been unforgettable. Sun-bleached bone, dried blood, and the faint metallic tang of death lingering in the air. And this wasn't just about terror. It was about religion. The skulls were considered offerings to the gods, proof that the city had done its sacred duty to keep the universe alive. Each one was a story, a captured warrior, a sacrificial victim, a human life turned into a cosmic gift. Still, for an outsider, it would have been overwhelming. Imagine standing in front of a wall of human faces, each one a reminder of what could happen to you. The empty eye sockets, the cracked teeth, the way the wind whistled through the hollow skulls, it would feel like the dead themselves were watching you. The Tsongpantli was also practical. It was psychological warfare at its finest. If you were an emissary from a rebellious town, one look at that skull rack would tell you exactly what would happen if you defied the empire. No speeches required. The message was loud and clear. And it wasn't just warrior skulls. Some came from criminals, some from captives taken in raids, others from ritual sacrifices offered during festivals. Over time, the rack became a living record of the city's religious and military victories, a gallery of death that grew with every triumph. For you, walking past it would never get easier. Every trip to the market, every visit to the temple would take you by those grinning skulls. You'd count yourself lucky every time you weren't one of them, but you'd never forget that someday you might be. So when people call Tenochtitlan beautiful and advanced, which it absolutely was, they're right. But it was also a city where the skyline included pyramids, canals, and walls of human heads. And you'd have to learn to keep walking past them like everyone else.
Torture before death. It wasn't always a quick trip up the temple steps. Sometimes the Aztecs believed that the gods deserved more than just a heart. They deserved the suffering that came before it. For certain rituals, prisoners weren't sacrificed right away. They were starved, burned, or otherwise tormented for days to season them before the final offering. Imagine being captured in battle, expecting the usual quick ritual death, and instead being locked up in a dark cell with barely enough food to keep you alive. Each day, guards come to take you out, not to kill you, but to humiliate you, to dance, to sing, to mock you as the crowd watches. Some victims were forced to play the role of gods in ceremonial costumes, paraded through the city while being treated like living idols, only to be killed at the end of the festival. And some fates were even worse. Victims chosen for fire sacrifices were slowly burned alive, their bodies blackening as priests prayed and the crowd watched. Sometimes they were kept just close enough to the fire to burn painfully without dying right away, until the priests finally stepped in to finish the job with a blade. The gall wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was to heighten the sacredness of the offering. Pain and endurance made the sacrifice more meaningful, showing the gods that the victim had given everything, even their suffering. To the Aztecs, this wasn't barbaric. It was holy theater, a way to make the ritual more powerful. For you, though, it would be pure nightmare fuel. Imagine sitting in a cell, hearing drums echoing from the temple, smelling the smoke from earlier sacrifices, knowing you were next, but not knowing when. Your body would grow weaker every day, your stomach gnawing with hunger, your throat dry, until even death started to look like a relief. The crowd's role made it even more intense. These weren't private tortures, they were public events. People came to watch, not out of cruelty, but out of religious duty.
Children, merchants, nobles, everyone was there to witness your final moments, because your suffering was supposed to benefit them too. And if you were unlucky enough to be chosen for the Shukshialpo, the gladiatorial ritual we already covered, you'd first have to fight, wounded and starving, before being finished on the altar. So surviving the Aztec Empire wasn't just about avoiding capture. It was about avoiding becoming entertainment before your death. Because if the gods were hungry enough, your end wouldn't just be fast and bloody. It would be slow, painful, and unforgettable for everyone watching. Death by arrow shower. You're standing in the temple courtyard, your arms bound, your body painted with bright colors, flowers tied into your hair. The air smells of incense and fresh-cut blossoms. For a moment, it almost feels like a festival, until you look up and see the warriors lining up with their bows. The Aztecs called this the flowered death, and it was as poetic as it was terrifying. This ritual was often dedicated to the god Mixcoatl or other deities tied to hunting, war, and fertility. Instead of a knife or a fire, the victim was placed in the center of the courtyard and turned into a living target. The goal wasn't to kill with the first arrow. It was to fill the body with shafts, each one symbolizing a gift to the gods. The archers stood in a circle, and when the signal was given, the arrows rained down in volleys. They aimed for arms, legs, torso, slowly turning the victim into what some sources described as a flowering tree covered in arrows. The pain must have been indescribable, but the ritual required that the victim stay standing as long as possible, transforming suffering into a display of strength. To the Aztecs, this was a beautiful death. The victim's body became a living offering, a canvas of flowers and feathers and obsidian-tipped arrows. When they finally collapsed, their heart was removed and offered to the gods, completing the ceremony. For the people watching, this wasn't meant to be horrifying. It was meant to be uplifting, a celebration of courage and devotion. The courtyard would be decorated with garlands, music would play, and dancers would move in time with the rhythm of the archers' shots. Life, death, and art were all bound together in that single moment. But for you, standing there in the center, it would be something else entirely. You'd hear the creak of bows being drawn, the sudden hiss of arrows cutting through the air, the sting as each one struck. The crowd wouldn't scream or panic. They'd cheer. They believed they were watching the world be renewed, one arrow at a time. Even if you weren't the victim, just being there would leave you shaken. The image of a human figure pierced with dozens of arrows, swaying like a tree before collapsing, would be burned into your mind. And you'd know that it wasn't an anomaly. It was one of many ways the Aztecs kept the gods fed. So while the Aztecs called it a flowered death, to you it would feel like a storm of pain. In a world where sacrifice was everywhere, this one turned death itself into a kind of grim living artwork, with you as the centerpiece.
Drowning sacrifice. The crowd gathers by the edge of the lake, but there are no drums this time, No clashing weapons, no shouting priests, only the sound of rippling water. A young woman is led forward, dressed in blue and adorned with water lilies. She isn't struggling, maybe because she knows this death is meant to bring life. She is about to be drowned as an offering to the water gods. The Aztecs had a whole pantheon of deities tied to water. Tlaloc, the rain god, and his fearsome helpers, the Tlaloque, who controlled storms, floods, and lightning. When the rains failed, the entire city could starve. So, in times of drought, or during annual ceremonies, women, often chosen for their beauty, were sacrificed by drowning to plead for rain. The ritual was both solemn and terrifying. The victim might be taken to a sacred spring, a cave, or even to Lake Texcoco itself. There, priests would perform prayers and chants, calling upon the water deities to accept the offering. Then the woman would be held under the water until she stopped struggling. Her body left for a time as the community prayed for the rains to come. To the Aztecs, this wasn't cruelty, it was reciprocity. Water gave life, so life was returned to the water. The drowned woman became part of the sacred cycle, joining the gods in their watery paradise. Her death was seen as a gift, and her spirit was believed to bring the rain needed to save the people. But for you watching, the scene would be haunting. The lake might be calm, the sky cloudless, as you saw her disappear beneath the surface. The sound of splashing, the muffled gasps, and then the terrible quiet afterward would hang in the air until the priests finally pulled her out. This wasn't an isolated event either. Entire ceremonies could involve multiple victims, each one drowned in turn, their bodies lined up afterward as offerings. And just like with child sacrifice, tears were considered a good omen. If the victims wept on the way to their deaths, the people believed rain was guaranteed. Imagine living in a city where you prayed for rain, but part of that prayer might involve giving up someone you knew, maybe even someone from your own household. You wouldn't just watch the ceremony. You'd depend on it, hoping desperately that the sacrifice was enough to save the crops. So while we think of drowning as one of the most terrifying ways to die, to the Aztecs it was a sacred act of renewal. But if you were there, it wouldn't feel holy. It would feel like holding your breath alongside the victim, waiting for the world to decide whether it would let either of you breathe again.
Warrior prestige. You're running through the chaos of battle, heart hammering, when you hear the sound of footsteps behind you. It's not random, it's personal. The Aztec warrior chasing you doesn't want to kill you. He wants to capture you, because your capture might be his ticket to glory. In the Aztec Empire, being a warrior wasn't just a job. It was the most respected way to climb the social ladder. And success wasn't measured by how many enemies you killed, but by how many you brought back alive. A single captive could earn you a new title, special clothes, and better food. 4 captives? You could join the ranks of the jaguar or eagle warriors, dine with nobles, and earn a place of honor in ceremonies. This made every battle intensely personal. Warriors went into combat with one goal: grab someone.
They trained for it from childhood, practicing how to wound without killing, how to wrestle an enemy to the ground, how to tie them up quickly before someone else snatched them first. Captives were so valuable that warriors fought over them on the battlefield, because whoever got credit for the catch got the reward. Imagine how terrifying that would be for you. Instead of a quick death, you'd find yourself hunted, tackled, and dragged back toward enemy lines, while other warriors tried to steal you away mid-struggle. You weren't just a random soldier. You were a prize, a walking promotion opportunity. And your fate didn't end on the battlefield. Once back in Tenochtitlan, you'd be dressed in elaborate costumes and paraded through the streets before being sacrificed. And the warrior who caught you would be the star of the show. He'd get to dance, boast, and even share in ritual feasting in your honor. This system kept the Aztec military fierce and motivated. Every man had something to prove, and the more captives he brought in, the higher he climbed. It wasn't just about personal pride. It affected his entire family's status. His children could gain access to better schools. His house could get bigger, and his name would be remembered. For you, that meant you couldn't just run and hide. Someone out there was actively looking for you and was very determined to succeed. Every stumble, every pause to catch your breath would put you closer to becoming someone's ticket to advancement. So while most armies in history measured glory in kills, the Aztecs measured it in alive bodies. That meant the battlefield was less about slaughter and more about hunting. And you were the game. Surviving meant staying out of reach, because every warrior there had something to gain from seeing you climb those temple stairs.
Mandatory labor. Picture this. You wake up sore from yesterday's work, hoping to take it easy, and someone from your Kalpuli neighborhood clan knocks on your door telling you it's your turn to haul stones for a new temple. There's no saying no, because in the Aztec Empire, every citizen owed labor to the state. This system was called tequio, and it applied to everyone, from farmers to artisans. It wasn't a punishment. It was a civic duty. You might spend weeks farming your family's plot, then suddenly be called to dredge canals, repair causeways, build temples, or transport tribute goods to the capital. The work could be backbreaking, and it didn't matter if you were tired, sick, or busy. The empire needed hands, and you had 2 of them. And this wasn't just occasional volunteering. It was expected, organized, and strictly enforced. Officials kept track of who had done their share. Skip your turn and you'd face fines, public shame, or even harsher punishments. The idea was that everyone contributed to keeping the city running, whether by growing food, maintaining infrastructure, or helping with massive construction projects. Imagine living in Tenochtitlan when a major building project began. The city's population could be mobilized like an army of workers, thousands of people hauling stone, wood, and earth to create new temples or public spaces. You'd spend sunrise to sunset carrying materials, your feet covered in mud, your back aching, but there'd be no complaining. It wasn't just physical labor, it was religious duty.
Temples weren't just buildings. They were homes for the gods, and leaving them unfinished would be unthinkable. And if you were a porter, one of the tlameme, life was even harder. You'd be strapping heavy loads to your back with a tump line across your forehead, walking miles to deliver tribute or supplies. There were no pack animals, no carts, no shortcuts. Your legs and spine were the empire's delivery system. For you, as a modern outsider, this would be exhausting. There would be no such thing as me time. Even after working your own field or selling your goods at the market, you could be summoned to carry wood to the temple or dredge lake mud for chinampas. And you'd better show up, because failing to do your part wasn't just shirking work. It was seen as disrespecting your community and the gods. So survival here wasn't just about keeping yourself fed and safe. It was about keeping pace with the demands of the entire empire. Everyone worked all the time, for both their family and the state. And if you thought your boss today was demanding, imagine an entire civilization as your boss, watching to make sure you didn't take a single lazy day.
No iron tools. Grab a hammer. Now throw it away. In the Aztec Empire, there was no iron, no steel, no metal chisels or saws. Every temple, every canal, every piece of art you've ever seen from Tenochtitlan was made with stone, obsidian, or wood. And yes, that meant everything took longer, hurt more, and wore you out faster. The Aztecs had no blacksmiths making iron blades or bronze plows. Instead, their cutting edge was obsidian, volcanic glass that could be sharper than modern scalpels. It was perfect for knives and sacrificial blades, but terrible for heavy work. Obsidian shatters easily, so if you tried chopping wood or quarrying stone with it, the blade would break. That meant tasks had to be done with crude stone axes, wooden tools, or sheer muscle power. Think about farming. In Europe or Asia, farmers used iron plows pulled by animals. In the Valley of Mexico, you bent over with a wooden digging stick, jabbing it into the soil by hand, row after row for hours. Building? Instead of metal chisels, masons chipped away at stone with harder stone. Instead of iron saws, carpenters hacked with obsidian flakes or shaped wood with shell scrapers. Imagine trying to cut a beam for a house without a single metal tool. And yet, somehow, they pulled it off. The Templo Mayor, the canals, the causeways, all those massive works were built with stone and wood tools, backed by endless human labor. That meant projects took armies of workers, not just a few skilled craftsmen. Thousands of people had to chip, grind, polish, and haul materials by hand. Now picture yourself in that system. You're told to help quarry stone for temple construction. Instead of steel pickaxes, you're handed a rough stone hammer that blisters your hands within the first hour. Chips of rock sting your face, your muscles burn, and after a whole day of work, the progress looks pitiful. And you still have to haul the heavy blocks back without carts or animals to help. Even basic tasks were slower. Need a fishing hook? It's made of bone, sharpened painstakingly with stone. Need a needle? Bone or cactus thorn. Every tool dulled fast and had to be remade or resharpened. Work never got easier. What's incredible is that despite all this, the Aztecs achieved astonishing feats of engineering and artistry.
Their obsidian blades could slice so finely that surgeons today would admire them. Their stone carvings were precise and intricate, but behind the beauty was sweat, oceans of sweat. So while you might admire the grandeur of Aztec temples and canals, try imagining building them without iron, nails, saws, or drills, just stone, wood, and human hands. For them, it was normal. For you, it would be slow, exhausting torture, and a whole new respect for how much labor and empire can squeeze out of the human body.
Grinding corn by hand. Before you picture yourself strolling through the Aztec markets eating tamales, stop and imagine this. Every single tortilla you bite into started with hours of someone kneeling on the floor, grinding corn by hand. And if you were a woman in Tenochtitlan, that someone was probably you. Corn, maize, was the heart of the Aztec diet. It wasn't just food, it was life itself, considered a divine gift from the gods. But maize doesn't turn into soft, fluffy tortillas by magic. First, the kernels had to be soaked in lime water to make them digestible, then rinsed, and finally ground on a metate, a flat stone slab with a stone roller called a mano. Grinding corn wasn't a quick job. It could take hours every single day just to prepare enough dough for one family's meals. Women would wake before sunrise, kneel in front of the metate, and push the mano back and forth, until the kernels became a smooth, warm masa. The sound of stone on stone was the background noise of every Aztec neighborhood. Now imagine doing this while your knees press into the hard floor, your arms straining, your back slowly aching as the hours go by. The work was rhythmic but exhausting, and it never ended. By the time you finished grinding the morning batch, you might already need to start preparing for the next meal. And this wasn't just women's work in the dismissive sense. It was sacred. A well-ground masa was a sign of a diligent, respectable household. A poorly prepared batch could bring shame on your family. There are even accounts of women being punished if they neglected their grinding duties. If you were a modern visitor, you'd probably give up after 10 minutes. The physical strain was enormous, and there was no kitchen gadget to save you. No blenders, no mills, no electric anything. Just you, a slab of volcanic stone, and a pile of corn that had to become tortillas before anyone in your family could eat. The sheer labor involved meant that every tortilla you ate carried the weight of hours of effort. The Aztecs ate maize for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Tamales, atole corn drink, and tortillas were the staples of nearly every meal, so the metate was one of the most important objects in any household. So while we admire the Aztec diet today as healthy and sophisticated, surviving in that world meant grinding corn until your shoulders ached and your fingers blistered every single day. If you ever thought making dinner was a chore, try kneeling in the dark for 2 hours just to get breakfast started.
Sleeping on reed mats. You finally finish a long day of hauling water, grinding corn, or building causeways. Your back is screaming, your knees feel like stone, and now it's time for bed. Except bed in the Aztec Empire didn't mean a soft mattress or fluffy pillow. It meant a petate, a woven reed mat on the hard floor, and if you were lucky, maybe a thin cotton blanket. The petate was the Aztec version of an all-purpose mat. You slept on it, sat on it, even wrapped things in it for storage. At night, you'd roll it out on the packed earth floor of your house, curl up, and try to get comfortable. The mats were stiff, scratchy, and flat. No cushion, no springs, no feathers. If you had a long day of labor behind you, there was nothing to cradle your sore muscles. And pillows? Forget it. Most people used a folded-up cloak or nothing at all. Nobles might have had something softer, but commoners had to make do with whatever was lying around. If it was cold, you could pile on more blankets or huddle close to a fire. But there was no cozy bed to crawl into. Sleeping on a petate also meant sharing space with everyone else in your household. There were no private bedrooms. The entire family often slept in the same room. That meant listening to your parents, your siblings, maybe even the family dog snoring a few feet away. If you had a baby, good luck sleeping through the crying. There was nowhere to escape to. And comfort wasn't the only issue. The floor could be cold and damp, especially during the rainy season. Bugs could crawl across the mat, and smoke from the cooking fire might linger in the house all night, stinging your eyes as you tried to rest. But for the Aztecs, this wasn't miserable. It was normal. Sleeping on a petate was part of life, and even had symbolic meaning. Being on the mat meant being humble, living a good and honorable life. Important ceremonies were even held on mats because they represented duty and respect. Still, for you, as a modern outsider, it would be rough. You'd toss and turn trying to find a comfortable spot, your hips aching from the hard floor. By morning, your joints would feel like you'd aged 10 years overnight. And then you'd still have to wake up before dawn to start grinding corn or heading to the fields. So when you think about surviving the Aztec Empire, don't just picture the battles and sacrifices. Picture lying awake on a thin mat, staring at the smoky ceiling, listening to the distant drums of the temple, and knowing another exhausting day is coming.
Constant smoke. Step inside a typical Aztec home, and the first thing you'd notice wouldn't be the colorful pots or the smell of cooking maize. It would be the smoke. Thick, eye-watering smoke that stung your throat and made your clothes smell like campfire, because almost all cooking was done indoors on open hearths. Every home had a little fire pit, and it stayed busy all day. You'd wake up to the crackle of wood and the hiss of tortillas cooking on the comal. Sounds cozy, right? Until you realized there was no chimney. The smoke just collected inside the house, curling up toward the rafters, clinging to the walls, filling your nose until your eyes started to water. For the Aztecs, this was normal. You'd get so used to the haze that you might not even notice it anymore, except for the coughing fits, the constant runny nose, and the irritated eyes. Kids grew up in that smoke from birth, their lungs toughening to the daily onslaught. Outsiders, though, you'd be hacking and wheezing within minutes. And it wasn't just cooking that made the air thick. Fires were used for heat, light, and ritual incense.
On festival days, entire neighborhoods could smell of copal resin as priests burned huge quantities to honor the gods. Add in the occasional ash from volcanic activity drifting through the valley, and you were breathing in a cocktail of smoke nearly all the time. The effects could be miserable. Your house might feel warm and welcoming, but your eyes would sting constantly. Tears would run down your face while you tried to grind corn or weave cloth, and your lungs would feel heavy after hours of exposure. In the rainy season, when doors and windows stayed shut to keep out the damp, the smoke would hang even thicker, turning the air blue-gray. Imagine lying down at night on your reed mat, your hair still smelling like firewood, your chest feeling heavy as you tried to sleep. The next morning you'd wake with a sore throat and do it all again. But for the Aztecs, this wasn't just inconvenience, it was identity. The smell of smoke was part of life. It clung to you, your clothes, and everything you owned. Even public spaces were filled with it during rituals, so there was no true escape. For a modern visitor, it would feel suffocating. Your eyes would burn, your lungs would ache, and you'd start praying for fresh air. Except there was none. Even stepping outside might just trade hearth smoke for citywide haze from temple incense or cooking fires drifting through the streets. So surviving in Tenochtitlan didn't just mean enduring the rituals and the work. It meant living in a world where breathing itself felt like work. Every breath came with a hint of fire.
Strict market rules. Picture yourself stepping into Tlatelolco, the biggest market in the Aztec world. It's loud, colorful, and absolutely packed. Thousands of people bartering for everything from maize to obsidian knives to exotic feathers. It feels exciting until you accidentally haggle too aggressively, and suddenly a guard is dragging you toward the center of the plaza. Because here, breaking the rules could mean a public beating. The Aztec market wasn't a free-for-all. It had an entire system of laws and enforcers called Tianquispan Tlayacanque, market judges who patrolled the stalls, making sure everyone behaved. They weren't just there to stop thieves. They kept an eye on how people traded, whether sellers used proper weights, and whether buyers were being fair. Cheat a customer, shortchange someone, or try to sell fake goods, and you wouldn't just get yelled at. You'd be hauled in front of a judge right there on the spot. The punishment was public and humiliating. Thieves could have their heads shaved as a mark of shame, their goods confiscated, or they could be beaten with sticks while the whole crowd watched. And yes, this happened right in the middle of the market, with thousands of people seeing it. Imagine dropping by to buy chili peppers and suddenly watching a guy get whacked across the back for selling watered-down honey. The Aztecs believed this kind of punishment kept the market honest, which was important because Tlatelolco wasn't just a marketplace, it was the economic engine of the empire. This strictness also applied to behavior. Start a fight, you'd be punished. Get drunk in the market, punished. Spread rumors or cause a disturbance, punished. The market was supposed to be orderly, almost sacred, and breaking that order meant disrespecting the community. For a modern outsider, the experience would be tense. You'd have to watch your manners carefully, keep your hands off goods you hadn't bought, and speak politely or risk getting in trouble. No casual shoplifting, no accidental price switching, no wandering around trying to taste test everything. But the result was impressive. Spanish chroniclers were amazed at how clean, organized, and peaceful the market was, despite the massive crowds. You could buy goods from all over Mesoamerica, food, clothes, tools, even slaves, and know that cheating was rare because everyone was terrified of being caught. Still, you'd never fully relax. The sight of those market judges walking past with their staff would remind you that a wrong move could make you the next lesson for the crowd. So surviving in Tlatelolco wasn't just about having enough cacao beans to trade. It was about keeping your head down, your manners perfect, and your hands very, very honest.
Court spying. Imagine standing in the marketplace, arguing over the price of maize, when you feel a chill, not from the weather, but because you just spotted a judge watching you from across the plaza. In the Aztec Empire, the judicial system was everywhere, and everyone knew it. Judges weren't dusty bureaucrats tucked away in dark rooms. They were powerful, respected, and feared. These were the Tlaxitlan, trained legal officials appointed by the state, and their job was to make sure justice happened quickly, sometimes brutally. They didn't wait for complaints to pile up. They actively kept an eye on the city, and their spies made sure they knew who was misbehaving. If you were accused of cheating, lying, or breaking a law, you'd be summoned to stand before them, and this wasn't some slow, drawn-out trial. The Aztecs prided themselves on fast justice. Witnesses were questioned, punishments were handed out, and if you were found guilty, the sentence could be carried out that same day. And the laws applied to everyone, even nobles. Even judges themselves could be executed if they were caught taking bribes, delivering unfair rulings, or abusing power. In fact, judges were held to higher standards than ordinary citizens. If they were caught cheating, they could be stripped of their status and put to death, often in public, to send a message. That made the court system incredibly intimidating. Imagine living in a city where not only were you constantly watched, but the people doing the watching had the power to end your life. A casual theft, a bad debt, even drunkenness outside of festival days could mean standing before the judges and hoping for mercy, which was rarely given. And the punishments were dramatic enough to make sure everyone remembered them. Thieves could be executed or enslaved. Adulterers could be stoned. Lazy farmers might have their houses torn down. Whatever the sentence, it was often carried out in front of the community, turning your crime into a cautionary tale. For you, as a modern visitor, this would be nerve-wracking. Every word, every trade, every action would feel like it might be overheard or reported. You'd never know who might be a spy for the court. Maybe your neighbor, maybe someone at the market, maybe the judge himself. But this system worked for the Aztecs. It kept order in a massive city of over 200,000 people, kept the markets fair, and made sure everyone, even the elite, respected the law. The price of that order, though, was living with constant vigilance.
So surviving under Aztec justice wasn't about memorizing the law. It was about living like someone was always watching. Because they were. And if they caught you, there'd be no plea deal, no delay, and no second chance.
Severe alcohol laws. You're at a festival in Tenochtitlan. Someone hands you a frothy gourd of pulque, a fermented drink made from maguey sap. You're hot, tired, and curious. You take a few sips and suddenly realize you may have just signed your own death sentence. In the Aztec Empire, alcohol wasn't forbidden, but it was heavily restricted. The drink of choice was pulque, cloudy, sour, and surprisingly strong. Nobles, priests, and elders could drink it freely during rituals, and it was offered in ceremonies to honor the gods. But for ordinary people, getting drunk outside of those sacred occasions could get you executed. The rule was strict. Commoners could only drink pulque in moderation during festivals or at special events. Even then, the expectation was 1 or 2 cups, enough to participate, but not enough to stumble. If you were caught drunk on a regular day, the punishment was severe. First-time offenders might be shamed publicly. Second-time offenders, death, no exceptions. Why so harsh? The Aztecs believed drunkenness led to chaos, laziness, and disrespect to the gods. In a society built on discipline and hard work, they couldn't afford citizens stumbling through the markets or skipping their labor duties because of a hangover. Alcohol was powerful, sacred, and dangerous, so it had to be tightly controlled. And the double standard made it worse. Nobles could drink more freely, since they were considered responsible enough to handle it. Elders, too, were allowed to get drunk without punishment, because age supposedly granted wisdom. But if you were a young farmer or craftsman caught with a buzz, you could find yourself hauled before a judge. Punishments were often public to drive the lesson home. A drunk commoner might be paraded through the streets, mocked, and then executed in front of everyone. The message was clear. Drinking wasn't just bad behavior. It was a threat to society itself. For you, as a modern outsider, this would be terrifying. Imagine coming from a world where a night out at the bar is normal, then suddenly finding yourself in a place where one beer equivalent could literally get you killed. Every sip would feel like rolling dice with your life. And pulque wasn't exactly easy to ignore. It was everywhere, at feasts, markets, and religious events. The smell of it alone, yeasty and sour, would tease you constantly. But you'd have to resist, or at least sip so cautiously that no one could accuse you of excess. So while today we complain about hangovers, in the Aztec Empire the stakes were much higher. One careless drink didn't just mean a bad morning, it could mean the last morning you'd ever have.
Child discipline. Think getting grounded was bad? In the Aztec Empire, misbehaving didn't get you sent to your room. It could mean getting your skin pierced or your face shoved into a cloud of burning chili smoke.
Child discipline was serious business in Aztec society. Parents weren't just raising kids, they were raising future farmers, warriors, and citizens who were expected to contribute to the community. Laziness, disrespect, or disobedience weren't just bad habits, they were considered threats to the family's honor and even insults to the gods. Punishments could be intense. If a child was caught slacking on chores, talking back, or being careless, parents might pierce their arms or legs with maggy thorns, small but painfully sharp. Bloodletting was a way to teach humility and remind the child of their duty. This wasn't done out of sadism. It was seen as part of shaping a good person. But the most infamous punishment was chili smoke. Parents would burn dried chili peppers, creating an eye-watering, throat-burning cloud of smoke. Misbehaving children were made to sit or kneel in the smoke until they cried and promised to behave. Imagine being 5 years old, coughing and sneezing, while your parents watched to make sure the lesson stuck. And this wasn't rare. It was expected. Aztec society valued discipline so highly that even lenient parents risked being judged by their neighbors for raising spoiled children. There are records of children being taken to public places to be punished as examples for others. Everyone understood that teaching obedience early was key to keeping society running smoothly. Punishments escalated with age. Older children who kept misbehaving could be sent to special schools where discipline was even harsher, or made to perform humiliating chores like sweeping public squares. The idea was to break bad habits before adulthood, when laziness or disrespect could result in real legal consequences, including death. For a modern outsider, this would be shocking to watch. We think of discipline as taking away screen time or grounding someone for a week. In Tenochtitlan, discipline involved blood, tears, and literal pain. But for the Aztecs, this wasn't cruelty, it was love. A well-disciplined child was a source of pride, and parents believed that enduring pain early would make their children stronger and better prepared for life's hardships. So, if you grew up in the Aztec Empire, childhood wasn't carefree. Every chore mattered, every mistake could hurt, and every punishment carried spiritual weight. You'd grow up knowing that life was hard and that it was your job to be even harder.
Compulsory education. In the Aztec Empire, skipping school wasn't just frowned upon, it wasn't even an option. Every child, rich or poor, went to school, and if you thought modern classrooms were strict, wait until you hear what Aztec kids went through. Education was divided by class. Nobles sent their kids to Calmecac, the priestly schools, where students trained to become priests, scribes, or government officials. Commoner kids went to Telpochilcali, the warrior houses, where they were trained to become soldiers, farmers, and public laborers. Either way, there was no, "I don't feel like going today." Attendance was mandatory, and discipline was intense. At Kalmekek, noble children lived almost like monks. They woke before dawn, prayed, fasted, and performed bloodletting rituals, sometimes pricking their ears or thighs with thorns to offer blood to the gods. They memorized hymns, practiced ritual dances, and learned the complex Aztec calendar systems. Food was plain, blankets were thin, and comforts were few. Telpochiltcali wasn't much easier. Commoner boys spent their days training with wooden weapons, running long distances, and performing exhausting chores like hauling firewood or cleaning public spaces. The idea was to harden their bodies and prepare them for war. They also learned songs, dances, and history because warriors were expected to know their culture as well as fight for it. And there were punishments for slacking off. Students who misbehaved might have their hair cut in a humiliating way, be pricked with maguey thorns, or even be made to inhale chili smoke, just like at home. Older students were sometimes forced to sweep the temple courtyards all night as penance. Girls also attended school, usually in the home of a midwife or in a separate kalmekak, where they learned weaving, cooking, child-rearing, and religious duties. Their education wasn't less strict. They too were taught discipline, obedience, and the importance of working hard. Imagine being a kid in this world. There's no sneaking out to play, no pretending to be sick to get a day off. Your entire childhood is about preparing for adulthood, whether that means becoming a priest, a soldier, or a good wife and mother. Even your leisure time is structured. Singing, dancing, and ball games were encouraged, but they were still tied to religious festivals and community duty. For a modern outsider, Aztec school life would feel closer to military boot camp than a cozy classroom. There were no paper and pencil tests, but you were tested every day on endurance, obedience, and your ability to contribute to society. So surviving childhood in Tenochtitlan didn't just mean avoiding punishment at home. It meant facing teachers who saw your body, your time, and even your blood as tools to shape you into a perfect servant of the empire.
Corn dependency. Imagine looking at your dinner table and realizing that almost everything on it, tortillas, tamales, atole, even the stuffing in your peppers, comes from the same plant. In the Aztec Empire, that plant was maize, and it made up nearly 80% of everyone's calories. That meant if corn harvests failed, the entire empire was in trouble. Maize wasn't just food, it was sacred, a divine gift from the god Sinteot. Every meal revolved around it. Tortillas for every plate, tamales for festivals, corn drinks for breakfast, and even corn used in religious offerings. But that dependence came with a massive risk. If anything disrupted the maize crop, famine could set in almost immediately. And there were plenty of ways for things to go wrong. Drought could kill the plants before they produced ears. Too much rain could rot the fields. Insects or blight could devastate entire chinampas. The Valley of Mexico had a short growing season, so a single bad year could mean months of empty granaries. When famine hit, it was brutal. People sold whatever they had to buy food, clothing, tools, even their own children into slavery just to survive. Chroniclers describe years when people were forced to eat grass, leaves, or even dirt to quiet their hunger. Entire villages would pack up and leave in search of food, sometimes dying on the road before finding help. And because the Aztec Empire relied on tribute from conquered regions, famine in one area could spread its effects everywhere. If subject towns couldn't send their corn quotas, Tenochtitlan itself would start to feel the shortage. That meant even ordinary citizens of the capital could end up starving if harvests failed far away. Imagine waking up one morning to find the markets nearly empty, the price of corn skyrocketing, and rumors spreading that there won't be enough to last until the next planting. Your family would ration tortillas, maybe cutting back to 1 or 2 a day. The gnawing hunger would make everyone irritable, and crime could rise as desperate people tried to steal what little food remained. Religious ceremonies grew more intense during these times. More sacrifices were offered to the rain gods, more prayers were said, more rituals performed, in the hopes that the skies would open and the maize would grow again. And if that didn't work quickly enough, things could turn grim, with more captives sacrificed and festivals growing larger, all to plead for cosmic mercy. So surviving in the Aztec Empire didn't just mean surviving war or disease. It meant surviving the terrifying dependence on a single crop. When maize grew, the empire thrived. When it failed, famine stalked the streets. And there was no plan B.
Amaranth banquet. You're handed a sweet, sticky little figurine made of seeds and honey. It looks harmless, almost like a holiday treat, until you find out it's been mixed with human blood. Welcome to the Aztec Amaranth Banquets. Amaranth was one of the Aztecs' favorite crops, tiny, nutritious seeds that could be popped, ground, or made into dough. But its most striking use wasn't in daily meals, it was in rituals. Priests would mix amaranth flour with honey or mud-gay syrup, and with blood taken from volunteers who had pierced their ears, tongues, or limbs for sacrifice. The dough was shaped into sacred images, gods, warriors, or symbolic objects. These figures were placed on altars and worshipped during ceremonies, sometimes for days. Then, at the climax of the ritual, they were broken apart and distributed to the crowd, who ate them together as a sacred meal. For the Aztecs, this wasn't creepy, it was holy. The mixture of seed, honey, and blood represented life itself. The earth, amaranth, sweetness, honey, and the essence of humanity, blood. Eating it meant taking the God into yourself, sharing in divine power. It was a kind of spiritual communion, a way of uniting the people with the gods in a very literal sense. But if you were a modern outsider, this would be a moment of pure shock. Imagine standing in the plaza, watching a massive amaranth figure of Huitzilopochtli, the war god,
being ceremonially killed, broken into pieces, and passed around. The priest hands you a piece, and suddenly you're holding what is essentially sacred candy laced with human blood. This wasn't a rare event either. These amaranth rituals happened during major festivals, especially those honoring gods of war and fertility. Everyone participated, nobles, commoners, even children. Refusing to eat might be seen as sacrilegious, a rejection of the gods and the community itself. The Spanish were horrified when they saw this practice, calling it satanic. In fact, after the conquest, they banned amaranth entirely because of its connection to pagan rituals. But for the Aztecs, this was one of the most joyful moments of the religious calendar, a feast, a celebration, and a reminder that their lives were tied to divine cycles. For you, though, this would feel like crossing a line you didn't even know existed. You'd have to smile, take a bite and swallow, while everyone around you cheered, knowing you'd just consumed something that was essentially sacred candy laced with human blood. So while today we might think of amaranth as a health food sold in organic shops, for the Aztecs it was far more intense. It wasn't just a snack. It was a way to taste the gods themselves, with a drop of human sacrifice mixed in for good measure. Dog meat. You walk into an Aztec feast expecting turkey or fish, and instead someone proudly serves you a steaming plate of dog. Not wild dog, not some random street animal, but a carefully bred, hairless dog called the Xolotzcuintli, considered a delicacy fit for nobles and special ceremonies. The Xolotzcuintli, or Xolo for short, was no ordinary dog. These were small, sleek, almost alien-looking animals with no fur, warm skin, and a calm temperament. They were raised not as pets, but as livestock, specifically to be eaten. Think of them as living pantry items, kept until it was time for a feast or ritual. Dog meat wasn't everyday food. It was special occasion food. Serving Xolo meat was a sign of honor, wealth, and respect for your guests. It was eaten during religious festivals, weddings, or when hosting important visitors. In fact, dogs were sometimes sacrificed to the gods alongside humans, their meat shared as part of the offering. For the Aztecs, this was nothing strange. Dogs were part of the sacred balance of life, just like turkeys, deer, and fish. Xolos even had spiritual significance. They were believed to guide souls to the underworld after death, which made eating them during funerary rituals especially symbolic. But for you, this would be awkward, to say the least. Imagine sitting cross-legged on a reed mat, being handed a tamale stuffed with something you recognize as dog meat. You can't refuse. It would be insulting to the host. So you smile, take a bite, and try not to think about the wagging tails you saw outside earlier. And it wasn't just the elite who ate them. Ordinary people could raise dogs too, though it meant saving them for special times. There are accounts of entire litters of puppies being raised for a single community feast. This wasn't a hidden practice. Everyone knew, and everyone participated.
The Spanish conquistadors were initially shocked, but eventually some even admitted that solo meat tasted good, rich and tender, like a cross between turkey and pork. Still, the practice became one of the first things suppressed after the conquest, as Europeans saw dogs primarily as hunting companions, not dinner. For the Aztecs, though, this was just practical and sacred at the same time. Dogs provided food, spiritual service, and even warmth. Xolos were known to sleep with their owners on cold nights as living heaters. Then, when the time came, they provided one last gift: their meat for the feast. So while the modern world sees dogs as man's best friend, in the Aztec Empire they were closer to man's best dinner. Surviving there meant getting used to the idea that the little hairless creature curled up in the corner wasn't just company, it was next month's main course.
No dairy, no sugar. You sit down for breakfast in Tenochtitlan and something feels wrong. There's no butter for your tortillas, no cheese to crumble on top, no milk for your atole. That's because in the Aztec Empire, dairy didn't exist. No cows, no goats, no sheep, which meant no milk, no butter, no cream, and no cheese. For the Aztecs, this wasn't strange. They didn't know they were missing anything. Their protein came from beans, turkey, fish, insects, and the occasional dog or deer. Their fat came from avocados and seeds. But for you, a modern visitor, it would be a shock. Imagine a world with no cheese on anything, no creamy sauces, no yogurt, no chocolate milk. Yes, they had cacao drinks, but they were bitter and spicy, not sweet and milky. And while we're at it, forget sugar too. There was no cane sugar in Mesoamerica. Sweetness came from honey or the syrup of the maguey plant. Tasty, sure, but rare and expensive. Most of the time, food wasn't sweet at all. Even cacao, the ancestor of modern chocolate, was usually served bitter, whipped into water with chili and cornmeal. No candy bars here, just a spicy, frothy, slightly gritty drink. For everyday people, meals were extremely simple: tortillas, beans, squash, chili peppers. Maybe some tomatoes or cactus if you were lucky. It was healthy, sure, low fat, high fiber, but it was repetitive. No buttered toast, no cream in coffee, no cheese to sprinkle on anything. Even nobles, with all their luxury, didn't have what we'd consider dessert. Their treats were things like cacao mixed with vanilla, or roasted amaranth seeds with honey. Good, but nowhere near as sugary as what you're used to. Imagine the cravings you'd have after a week. No ice cream, no pastries, no caramel, no hot cocoa with whipped cream. And if you thought you'd just milk a cow to fix the problem, think again. There were no cows in the Americas before Europeans arrived. You'd be stuck with what the Aztecs had, and they didn't seem to miss dairy at all. The flip side, people were healthier in some ways. No cheese meant no high cholesterol. No milk meant no lactose issues. No sugar meant no cavities from candy. But it also meant no creamy comfort foods, no baked sweets, no cheese pulls. So while you might admire the Aztec diet for being clean, living with it would be an adjustment. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner would all taste earthy, spicy, and savory, never creamy, never sweet in the way you expect.
Surviving here meant saying goodbye to lattes, buttered bread, and dessert, and learning to love chili on everything instead.
Chili beer. You're hot, thirsty, and tired from hauling wood all morning. Someone hands you a gourd full of pulque, the Aztec drink of choice, cloudy, foamy, and smelling faintly like overripe fruit. You take a big gulp and immediately regret it. Pulque was the empire's main alcoholic drink, made by fermenting the sap of the maguey plant. Think of it as an ancient cousin of beer, except thicker, sourer, and with a slimy texture that could surprise or horrify a first-time drinker. Outsiders often described it as tasting like the mix between sour milk and beer, with a hint of earthiness from the clay vessels it was stored in. And it wasn't always plain. The Aztecs liked to spice things up, literally. Pulque could be flavored with chili peppers, flowers, or herbs, giving it a fiery kick that might burn your throat if you weren't ready for it. For locals, this was delicious and invigorating. For you, it might send you straight to the edge of the plaza to throw up. Pulque wasn't just a casual drink, it was sacred. Certain festivals required drinking it as part of the ceremony, and priests used it in offerings to the gods. Nobles could enjoy it more freely, but commoners were only allowed to drink it during ritual occasions, and even then, getting drunk on it could be punishable by death, as we covered before. Still, when you did get to drink it, pulque packed a punch. It wasn't as strong as distilled liquor, but after a few gourds, you'd definitely feel it. That meant festivals could get rowdy fast. Music, dancing, loud jokes, but always under the watchful eye of authorities, making sure no one crossed the line into full drunkenness. For a modern visitor, pulque would be an experience. Imagine sipping something viscous and tangy, with a faintly sweet aftertaste and a chilly burn that made your eyes water. Your stomach might rebel, but refusing to drink would insult your hosts. And if you did manage to get through it, you'd still have to keep your composure so no one thought you were overindulging. Despite its strange texture, pulque was important nutritionally. It contained vitamins, minerals, and probiotics, basically an ancient health drink. It even played a role in feeding the poor during times of famine because it provided calories and hydration. But if you were expecting a crisp beer or smooth wine, you'd be in for a shock. Pulque wasn't made to be refined. It was made to be powerful, sacred, and a little wild. Surviving in the Aztec Empire meant learning not just to stomach it, but to smile after every mouthful. Grasshoppers and insects. You sit down for lunch in the Aztec market, and someone hands you a little snack wrapped in a corn leaf. You open it, and inside are roasted grasshoppers, still looking very much like grasshoppers. Legs, antennae, everything. And yes, you're expected to eat them. For the Aztecs, insects weren't weird food. They were staples. Protein was hard to come by in the Valley of Mexico. There were no cows, pigs, or chickens, so meat usually meant turkey, fish,
or wild game. To make up the difference, they turned to the lake and the fields for edible bugs. Grasshoppers, or chapulines, were one of the most popular snacks. They were toasted on a clay griddle until crispy, sometimes tossed with chili and lime for extra flavor. Yes, they had seasoning. They were sold by the handful in markets, a cheap, crunchy way to add protein to a meal. And it didn't stop there. The Aztecs also ate ant eggs, known as escamoles, sometimes called insect caviar, magyoi worms, water boatmen eggs, which they dried and turned into a kind of bug flour, and even dragonflies. If it crawled, hopped, or swam and had protein, it was probably on the menu. For locals, this was normal, even delicious. Kids grew up catching and eating roasted grasshoppers like we eat popcorn. Farmers collected insects during certain seasons, turning them into feasts. Even nobles enjoyed them, especially the pricier delicacies like ant eggs, which were considered a luxury dish. But for you, this would be a moment of culinary panic. Imagine crunching into a grasshopper, feeling the legs and wings crackled between your teeth, and trying not to think about the fact that you're basically eating a bug straight out of the field. And you'd better smile while you did it, because refusing would look rude. The nutritional value made it worth it, though. Insects were rich in protein, fat, and minerals, perfect fuel for a society where most calories came from corn. They were also sustainable, easy to gather, and could be dried and stored for later. The Aztecs were ahead of their time in using insects as a regular food source. Still, the idea of grabbing a bowl of toasted grasshoppers as a snack might make a modern outsider squirm. You'd smell the chili-spiced aroma drifting through the market, watch kids popping bugs into their mouths like candy, and know you'd eventually have to try one. So, surviving in Tenochtitlan meant learning not just to work and fight, but to eat what the land provided, even if it had 6 legs. And after a while, who knows, maybe you'd even start craving that crunchy, smoky flavor yourself.
Obsidian blade dentistry. Your tooth has been throbbing for days. You can't eat, can't sleep, and finally, you give in and go see the healer. But instead of a nice chair and anesthetic, you're told to sit still while someone comes at you with a shard of volcanic glass. Aztec dentistry was as brutal as it was ingenious. When a toothache got bad enough, healers didn't just tell you to live with it. They went after the problem directly. Using obsidian blades or stone drills, they would literally drill into your tooth to let out the infection or smooth out damage. And there was no painkiller beyond maybe some pulque or herbal poultice to take the edge off. You'd have to hold still while a sharp glass-like tool ground through enamel, sending pain shooting up your jaw. Imagine the sound, scraping, crunching, and the heat as friction built up. One wrong move, and the tooth could crack completely. If a tooth was too far gone, it might be pulled out entirely, again with stone tools.
No pliers, no sterile gauze, no antibiotics afterward. You just spit blood, pack the hole with herbs, and hope it didn't get infected. And yet, for all the pain, Aztec dental care wasn't primitive. They used natural antiseptics like chili, salt, and herbs to clean wounds. Some even decorated their teeth by filing them into shapes or inlaying tiny bits of jade or turquoise, a kind of status symbol that doubled as a fashion statement. Still, for you, as a modern outsider, the idea would be terrifying. A simple cavity today is fixed with numbing gel and a grill that takes minutes. In Tenochtitlan, you'd have to grit your teeth, literally, and endure the procedure while fully awake. Every scrape would feel like fire in your skull, and there was no guarantee it would work. Infection could still spread, abscesses could still form, and without antibiotics, a bad toothache could eventually turn deadly. So while we think of dentistry as a chore, in the Aztec Empire, it was an ordeal. You'd have to be tough enough to survive the pain, disciplined enough not to flinch, and lucky enough not to catch something afterward. Survival here wasn't just about dodging spears and staying out of temple rituals. It meant surviving the day you finally had to let someone put a piece of sharpened stone in your mouth. And afterward, you'd probably still have to go grind corn on your sore jaw the next morning.
No steel surgery tools. You're sick, injured, or unlucky enough to need surgery in the Aztec Empire. You're hoping for sharp scalpels, clean metal instruments, and maybe some numbing medicine. Instead, the healer pulls out a piece of obsidian, a sharpened shard of volcanic glass, and a few cactus spines. This is about to hurt. The Aztecs didn't have steel scalpels or surgical kits like we do today. But that didn't mean they didn't perform procedures. They were skilled at lancing abscesses, draining infections, stitching wounds, and even setting broken bones. But everything they did was with what they had: obsidian knives, deer bone needles, and plant fibers for thread. Obsidian was actually sharper than steel, so sharp that it could make a cut cleaner than many modern blades. In fact, surgeons today sometimes use obsidian scalpels in delicate operations because they slice so finely. But in the Aztec world, there was no antiseptic, no anesthesia, and no sterile operating room. That perfect cut still burned like fire, and infection was a constant threat. Stitches were done with natural fiber or human hair, pulled tight with bone or wooden needles. Imagine lying on a reed mat, clenching your teeth while a healer shows your skin back together, one slow poke at a time. For splinters or boils, cactus spines might be used as improvised tools to pierce and drain them. And pain wasn't avoided. It was embraced as part of the healing process. You might be given tobacco, pulque, or herbal medicine to dull the edge, but you'd still feel every slice, every stitch.
Some healers even blew chili smoke on wounds as a disinfectant, which must have felt like pouring fire straight into the cut. Despite how terrifying this sounds, Aztec medicine was surprisingly advanced. They used hundreds of medicinal plants, knew how to disinfect wounds with salt, and could set fractures so well that bones healed straight. But survival still depended on luck. A clean cut might save your life, or it might get infected and kill you faster than the original injury. For a modern visitor, this would be one of the hardest parts of living in the Aztec Empire. Imagine getting appendicitis, a deep cut, or an infected tooth, and knowing that the only option was to let someone open you up with a piece of glass and no anesthetic. You'd have to be brave just to hold still while the healer worked. So while the Aztecs had no still surgery tools, they still got the job done with stone, bone, and spines. But you'd leave every procedure with more scars, more pain, and a whole new respect for modern medicine.
Herbal purges. You go to the Aztec healer complaining of a stomach ache, hoping for something gentle, maybe a calming tea. Instead, you're handed a cup of bitter, slimy herbal brew, and within the hour, you're sprinting for the nearest bush. Welcome to Aztec cleansing. The Aztecs believed that many illnesses were caused by impurities inside the body, bad spirits or spoiled food, or an imbalance in your humors. The solution? Purge it all out. They had a whole arsenal of herbal laxatives designed to clean you from the inside out, no matter how unpleasant it was. Plants like plapat, a type of morning glory, and other strong herbs were brewed into teas or crushed into paste, then swallowed. Some were so potent they acted like modern medical purgatives, causing rapid, violent diarrhea. This was considered a good sign, proof that the badness was leaving your body. The problem, these purges could leave you completely drained, dehydrated, and miserable. There were no electrolytes to sip afterward, no soft drinks to recover with. You just lay on your reed mat, dizzy and weak, hoping the healer was right and that all this suffering would actually make you better. And this wasn't just a once-in-a-while treatment. Purging was sometimes done regularly as a form of spiritual or physical maintenance, almost like a detox program. People would fast, purge, sweat and steam baths, and bleed themselves, all in the name of cleansing. By the end, they were probably pure, but also exhausted. Imagine how this would feel as a modern visitor. You come down with a minor stomach bug, and suddenly you're forced to drink a concoction that makes the problem 10 times worse before it gets better. Your stomach's cramp, you're running back and forth for hours, and everyone around you just nods approvingly like this is completely normal. The Aztecs took it seriously, too. Some ceremonies even involved communal purges before festivals to ensure the whole community was ritually clean. Picture a whole group of people, all downing herbal brews and spending the rest of the day in miserable solidarity. Despite how extreme it sounds, this practice wasn't all bad. Some of these herbs really did have medicinal effects. They could clear parasites, empty the stomach of spoiled food, or stimulate the digestive system. But it was still risky. Severe dehydration was a real danger,
And for someone already sick or weak, a purge could push them over the edge. So surviving in the Aztec Empire meant more than surviving battle. It meant surviving the medicine. If the cure didn't kill you, it might just make you wish you'd skipped treatment entirely.
Bloodletting as cure. You go to the Aztec healer with a fever, expecting herbs or a steam bath. Instead, they sit you down, pull out a sharp obsidian shard, and calmly cut open a vein in your arm. Bloodletting wasn't a last resort here. It was one of the most common cures. The Aztecs believed that illness often came from imbalances inside the body. Heat, cold, bad winds, or even spiritual blockages. The solution? Let some of your blood flow out, releasing the sickness along with it. It was thought that if you were weak, your blood had gone bad, and cutting yourself open was the way to reset your system. This wasn't a gentle pinprick. The healer might slice your arm, leg, or even tongue with obsidian, a material sharp enough to make a perfect, clean cut. You'd bleed into a bowl or onto the earth while prayers were said, turning your treatment into a miniature ritual offering to the gods. And bloodletting wasn't just for the sick. Healthy people were expected to do it regularly as a way to keep themselves spiritually clean. Nobles and priests especially had to pierce their ears, calves, lips, or genitals, and let the blood drip onto paper or idols as part of their devotion. It was medicine, but also maintenance for the soul. Imagine being told to do this for a headache. You sit on a reed mat. The healer ties off your arm to make the vein bulge, and then slice. Warm blood flows down your skin, your head spins, and you just have to trust that this is going to make you feel better instead of worse. And there was no small dose of bloodletting. Some healers believed that the more you bled, the more impurities you lost. That meant patients could leave pale, dizzy, and at risk of fainting. In extreme cases, blood loss could make the illness worse or even kill the patient. Still, the Aztecs saw it as a necessary part of life. Blood was sacred, the thing that kept the sun moving and the world alive. So giving some of it up, even for your own health, was considered both practical and pious. For a modern outsider, this would be horrifying. You'd probably try to back away the second you saw the obsidian blade come out. But in Tenochtitlan, refusing would mark you as foolish or impious, someone unwilling to do what it took to get well and honor the gods at the same time. So surviving here didn't just mean surviving disease. It meant surviving the cure, too. Because sometimes the first step toward feeling better was literally watching your life drip out onto the floor. Pulque as medicine. You're about to have an abscess lanced or a bone reset in the Aztec Empire. There's no anesthesia, no numbing cream, no morphine. Just a gourd of pulque shoved into your hands with one instruction. Drink. Pulque, the fermented maguey sap drink we talked about earlier, wasn't just for festivals. It doubled as medicine. Healers used it as a kind of crude anesthetic. The idea was simple. Get the patient drunk enough that they wouldn't feel or care about what was about to happen.
This worked, to a point. After a few gulps, you'd start to feel warm and woozy. Your pain threshold would go up, your fear would go down, and the healer could get to work. But the process wasn't exact. There were no careful measurements, no IV drips, no count backwards from 10. Sometimes patients passed out entirely. Sometimes they didn't drink enough and stayed fully conscious. And sometimes they drank too much and never woke up. The surgery itself was no picnic. You'd be lying there, drunk and dizzy, while someone cut you open with an obsidian blade or reset a dislocated joint with a loud crack. If you blacked out, that was considered a blessing. You wouldn't feel a thing. If you stayed awake, well, hopefully the pulque dulled the edge. And pulque wasn't a clean anesthetic. It could make you vomit mid-procedure, dehydrate you, or leave you with a pounding head afterward. But the Aztecs considered it worth the risk. Better to drink yourself into a stupor than feel every second of what was coming. Sometimes pulque was used after the procedure as well, to help patients sleep through the pain of recovery. Imagine lying on a reed mat with fresh stitches, sipping a thick, sour drink until you drift off, hoping you don't roll over and tear your wound open in the middle of the night. For you, as a modern visitor, this would be a terrifying experience. You'd feel the buzz coming on fast, your body going floppy, and then see the healer standing over you with a stone knife. No sterile gloves, no clean table, just you, the drink, and a whole lot of trust that they knew what they were doing. And yet, pulque worked well enough to keep this system going for centuries. It dulled pain, calmed nerves, and gave patients the courage to go through with procedures that would otherwise be unbearable. So while you might be grateful for the numbing effect, surviving this kind of anesthetic meant surviving the whole hangover afterward. Because in the Aztec Empire, there's no waking up groggy in a recovery room. You just woke up sore, bloody, and probably a little drunk.
Crude bone setting. You trip on a causeway, hear a horrible crack, and look down to see your arm bent the wrong way. In the Aztec Empire, there are no hospitals, no x-rays, and definitely no painkillers, just a healer with a bundle of reeds, a few strips of cloth, and steady hands. Aztec medicine was surprisingly skilled at treating broken bones. Healers, called tichitl, knew how to manipulate a fracture back into place, then immobilize it using splints made of reeds, bark, or wooden sticks. The broken limb would be wrapped tightly with natural fibers to hold it still while it healed. But here's the catch. There was no anesthesia beyond maybe a bit of pulque or a calming herb. Setting the bone meant feeling and hearing the snap as it was pulled back into alignment. The pain would be sharp, white-hot, and unforgettable. You'd probably scream, and that was normal. Once the bone was set, the splint had to stay on for weeks. That meant no taking it off to scratch, no readjusting it if it felt uncomfortable, no swapping out for something cleaner. The same reeds stayed on until the healer decided it was safe to remove them. And then there was the risk of infection. Without modern antiseptics, any cut or open wound near the fracture could get infected easily. A splint that stayed too tight could also cut off circulation,
leading to swelling or even gangrene. In some cases, the limb might never heal straight, leaving you with a permanent limp or a crooked arm for life. Despite these dangers, Aztec healers were pretty advanced for their time. They used herbal poultices to reduce swelling, knew how to clean wounds with salt water, and even prescribed rest, which wasn't easy in a society where everyone was expected to work daily. But without antibiotics, even a minor complication could turn deadly. Imagine being stuck in a smoky house, lying on a reed mat for weeks with your arm or leg immobilized, trying not to move too much while your family carried on with their chores around you. Every itch, every bump, every accidental jostle would make you wince. And you'd know that if the bone didn't heal right, you might never be able to work, fight, or provide for your family the same way again. So while bone setting was life-saving, it was also a gamble. Surviving a broken limb in the Aztec Empire meant surviving the pain of having it yanked back into place, surviving the weeks of immobility, and surviving the very real chance of infection taking you down before the bone ever fully healed.
No germ theory. You wake up with a fever, chills, and a pounding headache. In the Aztec Empire, no one tells you it's an infection or a virus. Instead, everyone looks worried, not just for you, but for the entire family. Because sickness isn't just bad luck, it's a sign the gods are angry. The Aztecs didn't know about bacteria, viruses, or germs. They believed disease came from spiritual imbalance, black magic, or divine punishment. If you fell sick, it wasn't just a medical problem, it was a moral one. Maybe you had broken a taboo, skipped an offering, or offended a god without realizing it. That belief shaped how illness was treated. Healers, called titla, didn't just prescribe herbs, they performed rituals. They might blow tobacco smoke over you, wave obsidian knives to cut away evil winds, or sprinkle you with sacred water. Families might offer food, blood, or incense to appease the gods, asking them to lift the curse. Some illnesses were associated with specific deities. Skin diseases might be blamed on Tlazolteotl, the goddess of filth and purification, who was believed to punish sinners, but could also forgive them. Cures could involve confession of misdeeds as much as drinking an herbal remedy. And when entire communities got sick, say during a plague or epidemic, the response wasn't quarantines or sanitation. Instead, there might be mass rituals, fasting, and sacrifices to beg for relief. People believed that only by repaying the gods could the sickness be stopped. For a modern outsider, this would be frustrating and terrifying. You'd know there were invisible microbes causing the problem, but no one around you would wash hands, isolate the sick, or clean drinking water to stop it. You'd watch healers rub herbs on the patient or bleed them, hoping to draw out the poison, while the real infection kept spreading. And when people died, it wasn't just tragic, it was ominous. Death could be seen as proof that the gods were still displeased, leading to even more rituals, offerings, and sometimes human sacrifices to pay the debt. This way of thinking also meant preventative care barely existed. If you stayed healthy, it was just seen as good fortune or divine favor, not the result of hygiene.
Waterborne diseases like dysentery were rampant because people didn't understand the connection between dirty water and sickness. So surviving the Aztec Empire didn't just mean fighting off infections. It meant living in a world where every illness carried spiritual weight.
Language barrier. You finally work up the courage to talk to someone in the marketplace, but halfway through your sentence, their smile disappears. You've just said something wrong, and you don't even know what. Welcome to the Nahuatl language trap. Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, wasn't just words and grammar. It was full of layers, metaphors, and social rules. There were polite forms, casual forms, and ways of speaking reserved for nobles or priests. Get it wrong, and you could come across as disrespectful, arrogant, or even insulting without meaning to. For example, many ideas were expressed poetically. Instead of saying war, you might hear flower and song. Instead of death, the night of obsidian. If you took these literally, you'd be completely lost. Worse, using blunt words instead of the proper flowery language could make you sound rude or ignorant. And there were strict expectations about tone. Speaking too directly to a noble could be seen as overstepping your place. If you were too casual, you might sound disrespectful. Too formal, and you could sound like you were mocking them. It was a social tightrope, and everyone was listening carefully. This wasn't just a matter of embarrassment. In a society with harsh laws, a misunderstood phrase could have real consequences. Insulting someone of higher rank, even by accident, could land you in front of a judge. At best, you might owe an apology or goods as compensation. At worst, you could be beaten or executed for disrespect. Imagine trying to buy something at the market and accidentally using the wrong form of address for the seller, or greeting a priest too casually during a festival. You'd have no idea why everyone suddenly looked horrified until you were being dragged away for punishment. Even learning Nahuatl wasn't easy. It was an agglutinative language, meaning words could be stacked with multiple endings to create complex meanings. A single word could carry an entire sentence's worth of information. And if you missed one syllable, you might be saying something completely different. For you as a modern visitor, this would mean living in constant fear of misspeaking. Every interaction would feel like a test. You'd overthink every phrase, every greeting, every thank you, because one slip of the tongue might not just make you look foolish, it might make you an enemy. So while Tenochtitlan was a thriving, bustling city full of trade and conversation, surviving there meant more than just learning vocabulary. It meant learning how to speak carefully, respectfully, and poetically, or risk your words becoming your biggest danger.